Chapter 16 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. The physical sign of strain in Stampede's face, and the stolid effort he was making to say something which it was difficult for him to put into words, did not excite Alan as he waited for his companion's promised disclosure. Instead of suspense, he felt rather a sense of anticipation and relief. What he had passed through recently had burned out of him a certain demand upon human ethics, which had been almost callous in its insistence, and while he believed that something very real and very stern in the way of necessity had driven Mary Standish north, he was now anxious to be given the privilege of gripping with any force of circumstance that had turned against her. He wanted to know the truth, yet he had dreaded the moment when the girl herself must tell it to him. And the fact that Stampede had in some way discovered this truth and was about to make disclosure of it was a tremendous lightening of the situation. "Go on," he said at last. "What do you know about Mary Standish?" Stampede leaned over the table, a gleam of distress in his eyes. "It's rotten, I know it. A man who backslides on a woman the way I'm gonna ought to be shot. And if it was anything else, anything, I'd keep it to myself. But you've got to know, and you can't understand just how rotten it is, either. You haven't ridden in a coach with her during a storm that was blowing the Pacific out of bed, and you haven't hit the trail with her all the way from Chitina to the range as I did. If you'd done that, Alan, you'd feel like killing a man who said anything against her." "I'm not inquiring into your personal affairs," reminded Alan. "It's your own business." "That's the trouble," protested Stampede. "It's not my business. It's yours. If I'd guessed the truth before we hit the range, everything would have been different. I'd have rid myself of her some way, but I didn't find out what she was until this evening, when I returned Keok's music machine to their cabin. I've been trying to make up my mind what to do ever since. If she was only making her getaway from the States, a pickpocket, a coiner, somebody's bunco pigeon chased by the police, almost anything, we could forgive her. Even if she shot up somebody." He made a gesture of despair. "But she didn't. She's worse than that." He leaned a little nearer to Alan. "She's one of John Graham's tools sent up here to sneak and spy on you," he finished desperately. "I'm sorry, but I've got the proof." His hand crept over the top of the table. Slowly the closed palm opened, and when he drew it back, a crumpled paper lay between them. "Found it on the floor when I took the phonograph back," he explained. "It was twisted up hard. Don't know why I unrolled it, just chance." He waited until Alan had read the few words on the bit of paper, watching closely the slight tensing of the other's face. After a moment, Alan dropped the paper, rose to his feet, and went to the window. There was no longer a light in the cabin where Mary Standish had been accepted as a guest. Stampede, too, had risen from his seat. He saw the sudden and almost imperceptible shrug of Alan's shoulders. It was Alan who spoke, after a half-mixture of silence. "Rather a missing link, isn't it? Adds up a number of things fairly well, and I'm grateful to you, Stampede." "Almost. You didn't tell me." "Almost," admitted Stampede. "And I wouldn't have blamed you. She's that kind, the kind that makes you feel anything said against her is a lie. And I'm going to believe that paper is a lie, until tomorrow. Will you take a message to Tautuk and Amuktulik when you go out? I'm having breakfast at 7. Tell them to come to my cabin with their reports and records at 8. Later, I'm going up into the foothills to look over the herds." Stampede nodded. It was a good fight on Alan's part, and it was just the way he had expected him to take the matter. It made him rather ashamed of the weakness and uncertainty to which he had confessed. Of course they could do nothing with a woman. It wasn't a shooting business, yet. But there was a debatable future if the gist of the note on the table ran true to their unspoken analysis of it. Promise of something like that was in Alan's eyes. He opened the door. "I'll have Tautuk and Amuktulik here at 8. Good night, Alan." "Good night." Alan watched Stampede's figure until it had disappeared before he closed the door. Now that he was alone, he no longer made an effort to restrain the anxiety which the prospector's unexpected revealment had aroused in him. The other's footsteps were scarcely gone when he again had the paper in his hand. It was clearly the lower part of a letter sheet of ordinary business size, and had been carelessly torn from the larger part of the page, so that nothing more than the signature and half a dozen lines of writing in a man's heavy script remained. What was left of the letter, which Alan would have given much to have possessed, read as follows: "If you work carefully and guard your real identity in securing facts and information, we should have the entire industry in our hands within a year." Under these words was the strong and unmistakable signature of John Graham. A score of times Alan had seen that signature, and the hatred he bore for its maker and the desire for vengeance which had entwined itself like a fibrous plant through all his plans for the future, had made of it an unforgettable writing in his brain. Now that he had held in his hand words written by his enemy, and the man who had been his father's enemy, all that he kept away from Stampede's sharp eyes blazed in a sudden fury in his face. He dropped the paper as if it had been a thing unclean, and his hands clenched until his knuckles snapped in the stillness of the room, as he slowly faced the window through which a few moments ago he had looked in the direction of Mary Standish's cabin. So John Graham was keeping his promise, the deadly promise he had made in the 1 hour of his father's triumph, that hour in which the elder Holt might have rid the earth of a serpent if his hands had not revolted in the last of those terrific minutes which he as a youth had witnessed. And Mary Standish was the instrument he had chosen to work his ends. In these first minutes Alan could not find a doubt with which to fend the absoluteness of the convictions which were raging in his head, or still the tumult that was in his heart and blood. He made no pretense to deny the fact that John Graham must have written this letter to Mary Standish. Inadvertently she had kept it, and finally attempted to destroy it, and Stampede by chance had discovered a small but convincing remnant of it. In a whirlwind of thought he pieced together things that had happened: her efforts to interest him from the beginning, the determination with which she had held to her purpose, her boldness in following him to the range, and her apparent endeavor to work herself into his confidence. And with John Graham's signature staring at him from the table, these things seemed conclusive and irrefutable evidence. The industry which Graham had referred to could mean only his own and Carl Loman's, the reindeer industry, which they had built up and were fighting to perpetuate, and which Graham and his beef baron friends were combining to handicap and destroy. And in this game of destruction, clever Mary Standish had come to play a part. But why had she leapt into the sea? It was as if a new voice had made itself heard in Alan's brain, a voice that rose insistently over a vast tumult of things, crying out against his arguments and demanding order and reason in place of the mad convictions that possessed him. If Mary Standish's mission was to pave the way for his ruin, and if she was John Graham's agent sent for that purpose, what reason could she have had for so dramatically attempting to give the world the impression that she had ended her life at sea? Surely such an act could in no way have been related with any plot which she might have had against him. In building up this structure of her defense, he made no effort to sever her relationship with John Graham. That he knew was impossible. The note, her actions, and many of the things she had said were links inevitably associating her with his enemy. But these same things, now that they came pressing one upon another in his memory, gave to their conclusion a new significance. Was it conceivable that Mary Standish, instead of working for John Graham, was working against him? Could some conflict between them have been the reason for her flight aboard the Nome? And was it because she discovered Rosalind there, John Graham's most trusted servant, that she formed her desperate scheme of leaping into the sea? Between the two oppositions of his thought, a sickening burden of what he knew to be true settled upon him. Mary Standish, even if she hated John Graham now, had at one time, and not very long ago, been an instrument of his trust. The letter he had written to her was positive proof of that. What it was that had caused a possible split between them, and had inspired her flight from Seattle, and later her effort to bury a past under the fraud of make-believe death, he might never learn, and just now he had no very great desire to look entirely into the whole truth of the matter. It was enough to know that of the past and of the things that happened she had been afraid, and it was in the desperation of this fear, with Graham's cleverest agent at her heels, that she had appealed to him in his cabin, and failing to win him to her assistance, had taken the matter so dramatically into her own hands. And within that same hour a nearly successful attempt had been made upon Rosslin's life. Of course the facts had shown that she could not have been directly responsible for his injury, but it was a haunting thing to remember as happening almost simultaneously with her disappearance into the sea. He drew away from the window, and opening the door went out into the night. Cool breaths of air gave a crinkly rattle to the swinging paper lanterns, and he could hear the soft whipping of the flags which Mary Standish had placed over the cabin. There was something comforting in the sound, a solace to the dishevelment of nerves he had suffered, a reminder of the day in Skagway when she had walked at his side with her hand resting warmly in his arm, and her eyes and face filled with the inspiration of the mountains. No matter what she was or had been, there was something tenaciously admirable about her, a quality which had risen even above her feminine loveliness. She had proved herself not only clever, she was inspired by courage, a courage which he would have been compelled to respect even in a man like John Graham, and in this slim and fragile girl it appealed to him as a virtue to be laid up apart and aside from any of the motives which might be directing it. From the beginning it had been a bewildering part of her, a clean, swift, unhesitating courage that had leaped bounds where his own volition and judgment would have hung waveringly. That one courage in all the world, a woman's courage, which finds in the effort of its achievement no obstacle too high and no abyss too wide, though death waits with outreaching arms on the other side. And surely, where there had been all this, there must also have been some deeper and finer impulse than one of destruction, of physical gain, or of mere duty in the weaving of a human scheme. The thought and the desire to believe brought words half aloud from Alan's lips, and he looked up again at the flags beating softly above his cabin. Mary Standish was not what Stampede's discovery had proclaimed her to be. There was some mistake, a monumental stupidity of reasoning on their part, and tomorrow would reveal the littleness and the injustice of their suspicions. He tried to force the conviction upon himself, and re-entering the cabin he went to bed, still telling himself that a great lie had built itself up out of nothing, and that the God of all things was good to him because Mary Standish was alive and not dead. The end of Chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. Alan slept soundly for several hours, but the long strain of the preceding day did not make him overreach the time he had set for himself, and he was up at 6 o'clock. Wegaruk had not forgotten her old habits, and a tub filled with cold water was waiting for him. He bathed, shaved himself, put on fresh clothes, and promptly at 7 was at breakfast. The table at which he ordinarily sat alone was in a little room with double windows, through which, as he enjoyed his meals, he could see most of the habitations of the range. Unlike the average Eskimo dwellings, they were neatly built of small timber brought down from the mountains, and were arranged in orderly fashion like the cottages of a village strung out prettily on a single street. A sea of flowers lay in front of them, and at the end of the row, built on a little knoll that looked down into one of the watered hollows of the tundra, was Sokwena's cabin. Because Sokwenna was the old man of the community, and therefore the wisest, and because with him lived his foster daughters, Keok and Nawadlook, the loveliest of Alan's tribal colony, Sokwena's cabin was next to Alan's in size. and Alan, looking at it now and then as he ate his breakfast, saw a thin spiral of smoke rising from the chimney, but no other sign of life. The sun was already up, almost to its highest point, a little more than halfway between the horizon and the zenith, performing the apparent miracle of rising in the north and traveling east instead of west. Alan knew the men folk of the village had departed hours ago for the distant herds. Always, when the reindeer drifted into the higher and cooler feeding grounds of the foothills, there was this apparent abandonment, and after last night's celebration the women and children were not yet awake to the activities of the long day, where the rising and setting of the sun meant so little. As he rose from the table, he glanced again towards Sokwenna's cabin. A solitary figure had climbed up out of the ravine and stood against the sun of the clough top. Even at that distance, with the sun in his eyes, he knew it was Mary Standish. He turned his back stoically to the window and lighted his pipe. For half an hour after that he sorted out his papers and range books in preparation for the coming of Tautuk and Amuk Toolik, and when they arrived, the minute hand of his watch was at the hour of 8. That the months of his absence had been prosperous ones, he perceived by the smiling eagerness in the brown faces of his companions, as they spread out the papers on which they had, in their own crude fashion, set down a record of the winter's happenings. Tautuk's voice, slow and very deliberate in its unfailing effort to master English without a slip, had in it a subdued note of satisfaction and triumph, while Amuk Toolik, who was quick and staccato in his manner of speech, using sentences seldom of greater length than 3 or 4 words, and who picked up slang and swear words like a parrot, swelled with pride as he lighted his pipe, and then rubbed his hands with a rasping sound that always sent a chill up Alan's back. "A very fine and prosper year," said Tautuk in response to Alan's first question as to general conditions. "We've been very fortunate." "One hell of a good year," backed up Amuk Toolik with the quickness of a gun. "Plenty calf, good hoof, moss, little wolf, herds fat. This year sheep each." After this opening of the matter in hand, Alan buried himself in the affairs of the range, and the old thrill, the glow which comes through achievement, and the pioneer's pride in marking a new frontier with the creative forces of success rose uppermost in him, and he forgot the passing of time. 100 questions he had to ask, and the tongues of Tautuk and Amuk Toolik were crowded with the things they desired to tell him. Their voices filled the room with a paean of triumph. His herds had increased by 1,000 head during the fawning months of April and May, and interbreeding of the Asiatic stock with the wild woodland caribou had produced 100 calves of the super animal whose flesh was bound to fill the markets of the States within a few years. Never had the moss been thicker under the winter snow. There had been no destructive fires. Soft hoof had escaped them, breeding records had been beaten, and daring in the edge of the Arctic was no longer an experiment, but an established fact. For Tautuk now had 7 deer giving 1.5 pints of milk each twice a day, nearly as rich as the best of cream from cattle, and more than 20 that were delivering from a cupful to a pint at a milking. And to this Amuk Toolik added the amazing record of their running deer Kauk. The 3-year-old had drawn a sledge 5 miles over unbeaten snow in 13 minutes and 47 seconds. Kauk and Olo in team had drawn the same sledge 10 miles in 26 minutes and 40 seconds, and one day he had driven the two 98 miles in a mighty endurance test. And with Eno and Sutka, the first of their interbreed with the wild woodland caribou and heavier beasts, he had drawn a load of 800 pounds for 3 consecutive days at the rate of 40 miles a day. From Fairbanks, Tanana, and the ranges of the Seaward Peninsula, agents of the swiftly spreading industry had offered as high as $110 a head for breeding stock with the blood of the woodland caribou, and of these native and larger caribou of the tundras and forests, 7 young bulls and 9 female calves had been captured and added to their own propagative forces. For Alan this was triumph. He saw nothing of what it all meant in the way of ultimate personal fortune. It was the earth under his feet, the vast expanse of unpeopled waste, reduced and scorned in the blindness of 100 million people, which he saw fighting itself on the glory and reward of the conqueror through such achievement as this. A land betrayed, rising at last out of the slime of political greed and ignorance, a giant irresistible in its awakening, that was destined in his lifetime to rock the destiny of a continent. It was Alaska, rising up slowly but inexorably out of its eternity of sleep, mountain-sealed forces of a great land that was once the cradle of the earth, coming into possession of life and power again. And his own feeble efforts in that long and fighting process of planting the seeds which meant its ultimate ascendancy possessed in themselves their own reward. Long after Tautuk and Amuk Tulik had gone, his heart was filled with the song of success. He was surprised at the swiftness with which time had gone when he looked at his watch. It was almost dinner hour when he had finished with his papers and books and went outside. He heard Wegaruk's voice coming from the dark mouth of the underground icebox dug into the frozen subsoil of the tundra, and pausing at the glimmer of his old housekeeper's candle, he turned aside, descended the few steps, and entered quietly into the big square chamber 8 feet under the surface, where the earth had remained steadfastly frozen for some hundreds of thousands of years. Wegaruk had a habit of talking when alone, but Alan thought it odd that she would be explaining to herself that the tundra soil, in spite of its almost tropical summer richness and luxuriance, never thawed deeper than 3 or 4 feet, below which point remained the icy cold placed there so long ago that even the spirits did not know. He smiled when he heard Wegaruk measuring time and faith in terms of spirits, which he had never quite given up for the missionaries, and was about to make his presence known, when a voice interrupted him, so close at his side that the speaker, concealed in the shadow of the wall, could have reached out a hand and touched him. "Good morning, Mr. Holt." It was Mary Standish, and he stared rather foolishly to make her out in the gloom. "Good morning," he replied. "I was on my way to your place when Wegaruk's voice brought me here. You see, even this icebox seems like a friend after my experience in the States." "Are you after a steak, Mammy?" he called. Wegaruk's strong squat figure turned as she answered him, and the limit from her candle, glowing brightly in a split tomato can, fell clearly upon Mary Standish as the old woman waddled toward them. It was as if a spotlight had been thrown upon the girl, suddenly out of a pit of darkness, and something about her, which was not her prettiness or the beauty that was in her eyes and hair, sent a sudden and unaccountable thrill through Alan. It remained with him when they drew back out of gloom and chill into sunshine and warmth, leaving Wegaruk to snuff her tomato can lantern and follow with the steak. And it did not leave him when they walked over the tundra together toward Sokwenna's cabin. It was a puzzling thrill, stirring an emotion which it was impossible for him to subdue or explain, something which he knew he should understand but could not. And it seemed to him that knowledge of this mystery was in the girl's face, glowing in a gentle embarrassment, as she told him she had been expecting him, and that Keok and Nawadlook had given up the cabin to them so that he might question her uninterrupted. But with this soft flush of her uneasiness revealing itself in her eyes and cheeks, he saw neither fear nor hesitation. In the big room of Sokwenna's cabin, which was patterned after his own, He sat down amid the color and delicate fragrance of masses of flowers, and the girl seated herself near him and waited for him to speak. "You love flowers," he said lamely. "I want to thank you for the flowers you placed in my cabin, and the other things." "Flowers are a habit with me," she replied, "and I have never seen such flowers as these. Flowers and birds, I never dreamed that there were so many up here." "Nor the world," he added. "It is ignorant of Alaska." He was looking at her, trying to understand the inexplicable something about her. She knew what was in his mind, because the strangely thrilling emotion that possessed him could not keep its betrayal from his eyes. The color was fading slowly out of her cheeks. Her lips grew a little tense, yet in her attitude of suspense and of waiting there was no longer a suspicion of embarrassment, no trace of fear, and no sign that a moment was at hand when her confidence was on the ebb. In this moment Alan did not think of John Graham. It seemed to him that she was like a child again, the child who had come to him in his cabin, and who had stood with her back against his cabin door, entreating him to achieve the impossible, an angel almost, with her smooth, shining hair, her clear, beautiful eyes, her white throat, which waited with its little heart-throb for him to beat down the fragile defense which now lay in the greater power of his own hands. The inequality of it, and the pitilessness of what had been in his mind to say and do, together with an inundating sense of his own brute mastery, swept over him, and in sudden desperation he reached out his hands toward her and cried, "Mary Standish, in God's name tell me the truth. Tell me why you have come up here." "I have come," she said, looking at him steadily, "because I know that a man like you, when he loves a woman, will fight for her and protect her, even though he may not possess her." "But you didn't know that, not until the cottonwoods," he protested. "Yes, I did. I knew it in Ellen McCormick's cabin." She rose slowly before him, and he too rose to his feet, staring at her like a man who had been struck, while intelligence, a dawning reason, an understanding of the strange mystery of her that morning, sent the still greater thrill of its shock through him. He gave an exclamation of amazement. "You were at Ellen McCormick's? She gave you that?" She nodded. "Yes, the dress you brought from the ship. Please don't scold me, Mr. Holt. Be a little kind with me when you have heard what I am going to tell you. I was in the cabin that last day when you returned from searching for me in the sea. Mr. McCormick didn't know, but she did. I lied a little, just a little, so that she, being a woman, would promise not to tell you I was there. You see, I had lost a great deal of my faith, and my courage was about gone, and I was afraid of you." "Afraid of me?" "Yes, afraid of everybody. I was in the room behind Ellen McCormick when she asked you that question, and when you answered as you did, I was like stone. I was amazed and didn't believe, for I was certain that after what had happened on the ship you despised me, and only through a peculiar sense of honor were making the search for me. Not until 2 days later, when your letters came to Ellen McCormick and we read them." "You opened both?" "Of course. One was to be read immediately, the other when I was found. And I had found myself. Maybe it wasn't exactly fair, but you couldn't expect two women to resist a temptation like that. And I wanted to know." She did not lower her eyes or turn her head aside as she made the confession. Her gaze met Alan's with beautiful steadiness. "And then I believed. I knew, because of what you said in that letter, that you were the one man in all the world who would help me and give me a fighting chance if I came to you. But it has taken all my courage. And in the end you will drive me away." Again he looked upon the miracle of tears in wide open, unfaltering eyes, tears which she did not brush away, but through which in a moment she smiled at him as no woman had ever smiled at him before. And with the tears there seemed to possess her a pride which lifted her above all confusion, a living spirit of will and courage and womanhood, that broke away the dark clouds of suspicion and fear that had gathered in his mind. He tried to speak, and his lips were thick. "You have come because you know I love you, and you—" "Because from the beginning it must have been a great faith in you that inspired me, Alan Holt." "There must have been more than that," he persisted. "Some other reason." "Two," she acknowledged, and now he noticed that with the dissolution of tears a flush of color was returning to her cheeks. "And those?" "One it is impossible for you to know. The other, if I tell you, will make you despise me. I am sure of that." "It has to do with John Graham?" She bowed her head. "Yes, with John Graham." For the first time long lashes hid her eyes from him, and for a moment it seemed that her resolution was gone, and she stood stricken by the import of the thing that lay behind his question. Yet her cheeks flamed red instead of paling, and when she looked at him again her eyes burned with a lustrous fire. "John Graham," she repeated, "the man you hate and want to kill." Slowly he turned toward the door. "I'm leaving immediately after dinner to inspect the herds up in the foothills," he said, "and you are welcome here." He caught the swift intake of her breath as she paused for an instant at the door, and saw the new light that leaped into her eyes. "Thank you, Alan Holt," she cried softly. "Oh, I thank you." And then suddenly she stopped him with a little cry, as if at last something had broken away from her control. He faced her, and for a moment they stood in silence. "I'm sorry, sorry I said to you what I did that night on the Nome," she said. "I accused you of brutality, of unfairness, of even worse than that, and I want to take it all back. You are big and clean and splendid, for you would go away now, knowing I am poisoned by an association with a man who has injured you so terribly. And you say I am welcome. And I don't want you to go. You have made me want to tell you who I am and why I have come to you. And I pray God you will think as kindly of me as you can when you have heard." End of chapter 17 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 18 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. It seemed to Alan that in an instant a sudden change had come over the world. There was silence in the cabin, except for the breath which came like a sob to the girl's lips as she turned to the window and looked out into the blaze of golden sunlight that filled the tundra. He heard Tautuk's voice calling to Keok away over near the reindeer corral, and he heard clearly Keok's merry laughter as she answered him. A gray-cheeked thrush flew up to the roof of Sokwenna's cabin and began to sing. It was
as if these things had come as a message to both of them, relieving a tension and significant of the beauty and glory and undying hope of life. Mary Standish turned from the window with shining eyes. "Every day the thrush comes and sings on our cabin roof," she said. "It is possibly because you are here," he replied. She regarded him seriously. "I have thought of that, you know. I have faith in a great many unbelievable things. I can think of nothing more beautiful than the spirit that lives in the heart of a bird. I'm sure if I were dying I would like to have a bird singing near me. Hopelessness cannot be so deep that bird song will not reach it." He nodded, trying to answer in that way. He felt uncomfortable. She closed the door, which he had left partly open, and made a little gesture for him to resume the chair which he had left a few moments before. She seated herself first and smiled at him wistfully, half regretfully, as she said, "I have been very foolish. What I am going to tell you now I should have told you aboard the Nome, but I was afraid. Now I'm not afraid, but ashamed, terribly ashamed, to let you know the truth. And yet I'm not sorry it happened so, because otherwise I would not have come up here, and all this, your world, your people, and you have meant a great deal to me. You will understand when I have made my confession." "No, I don't want that," he protested almost roughly. "I don't want you to put it that way. If I can help you, and if you wish to tell me as a friend, that's different. I don't want a confession which would imply that I have no faith in you." "And you have faith in me?" "Yes. So much that the sun will darken and birdsong never seem the same if I lose you again, as I thought I had lost you from the ship." "Oh, you mean that?" The words came from her in a strange, tense little cry, and he seemed to see only her eyes as he looked at her face, pale as the petals of the tundra daisies behind her. With the thrill of what he had dared to say tugging at his heart, he wondered why she was so white. "You mean that," her lips repeated slowly, "after all that has happened, even after that part of a letter which Stampede brought to you last night?" He was surprised. How had she discovered what he thought was a secret between himself and Stampede? His mind leaped to a conclusion, and she saw it written in his face. "No, it wasn't Stampede," she said. "He didn't tell me. It just happened. And after this letter, you still believe in me?" "I must. I should be unhappy if I did not. And I am, most perversely, hoping for happiness. I have told myself that what I saw over John Graham's signature was a lie." "It wasn't that, quite. But it didn't refer to you or to me. It was part of a letter written to Rossland. He sent me some books while I was on the ship, and inadvertently left a page of this letter in one of them as a marker. It was really quite unimportant when one read the whole of it. The other half of the page is in the toe of the slipper which you did not return to Ellen McCormick. You know that is the conventional thing for a woman to do, to use paper for padding in a soft-toed slipper." He wanted to shout. He wanted to throw up his arms and laugh as Tautuk and Amok Tulik and a score of others had laughed to the beat of the tom-toms last night, not because he was amused, but out of sheer happiness. But Mary Standish's voice, continuing on its quiet and a matter-of-fact way, held him speechless, though she could not fail to see the effect upon him of this simple explanation of the presence of Graham's letter. "I was in Nawadlook's room when I saw Stampede pick up the wad of paper from the floor," she was saying. I was looking at the slipper a few minutes before, regretting that you had left its mate in my cabin on the ship, and the paper must have dropped then. I saw Stampede read it, and the shock that came in his face. Then he placed it on the table and went out. I hurried to see what he had found, and had scarcely read the few words when I heard him returning. I returned the paper where he had laid it, hid myself in Nawadlook's room, and saw Stampede when he carried it to you. I don't know why I allowed it to be done. I had no reason. Maybe it was just intuition, and maybe it was because just in that hour I so hated myself that I wanted someone to flay me alive, and I thought that what Stampede had found would make you do it. And I deserve it. I deserve nothing better at your hands." "But it isn't true," he protested. "The letter was to Rossland." There was no responsive gladness in her eyes. "Better that it were true, and all that is true were false," she said in a quiet, hopeless voice. "I would almost give my life to be no more than what those words implied, dishonest, a spy, a criminal of a sort. Almost any alternative would I accept in place of what I actually am. Do you begin to understand?" "I'm afraid I cannot." Even as he persisted in denial, the pain which had grown like velvety dew in her eyes clutched at his heart, and he felt dread of what lay behind it. "I understand only that I am glad you are here, more glad than yesterday or this morning or an hour ago." She bowed her head so that the bright light of day made a radiance of rich color in her hair, and he saw the sudden tremble of the shining lashes that lay against her cheeks, and then quickly she caught her breath, and her hands grew steady in her lap. "Would you mind if I asked you first to tell me your story of John Graham?" she spoke softly. "I know it a little, but I think it would make everything easier if I could hear it from you now." He stood up and looked down upon her where she sat, with the light playing in her hair. And then he moved to the window and back, and she had not changed her position, but was waiting for him to speak. She raised her eyes, and the question her lips had formed was glowing in them as clearly as if she had voiced it again in words. A desire rose in him to speak to her as he had never spoken to another human being, and to reveal for her, and for her alone, the thing that had harbored itself in his soul for many years. Looking up at him, waiting, partial understanding softening her sweet face, a dusky glow in her eyes, she was so beautiful that he cried out softly, and then laughed in a strange, repressed sort of way as he half held out his arms toward her. "I think I know how my father must have loved my mother," he said. "But I can't make you feel it. I can't hope for that. She died when I was so young that she remained only as a beautiful dream for me. But for my father, she never died. And as I grew older, she became more and more alive for me, so that in our journeys we would talk about her as if she were waiting for us back home, and would welcome us when we returned. And never could my father remain away from the place where she was buried very long at a time. He called it home, that little cup at the foot of the mountain, with the waterfall singing in summer, and a paradise of birds and flowers keeping her company, and all the great wild world she loved about her. There was the cabin too, the little cabin where I was born, with its back to the big mountain, and filled with the handiwork of my mother as she had left it when she died. And my father too used to laugh and sing there. He had a clear voice that would roll halfway up the mountain, and as I grew older the miracle at times stirred me with a strange fear, so real to my father did my dead mother seem when he was home. But you look frightened, Miss Standish. Oh, it may seem weird and ghostly now, but it was true, so true that I have lain awake nights thinking of it and wishing that it had never been so. Then you have wished a great sin, said the girl in a voice that seemed scarcely to whisper between her parted lips. I hope someone will feel toward me some day like that. But it was this which brought the tragedy. The thing you have asked me to tell you about, he said, unclenching his hands slowly, and then tightening them again until the blood ebbed from their veins. Interests were coming in. The tentacles of power and greed were reaching out, encroaching steadily a little nearer to our cup at the foot of the mountain. But my father did not dream of what might happen. It came in the spring of the year he took me on my first trip to the States, when I was 18. We were gone 5 months, and they were 5 months of hell for him. Day and night he grieved for my mother and the little home under the mountain. And when at last we came back... He turned again to the window, but he did not see the golden sun of the tundra or hear Tauto calling from the corral. When we came back, he repeated in a cold, hard voice, a construction camp of 100 men had invaded my father's little paradise. The cabin was gone. A channel had been cut from the waterfall, and this channel ran where my mother's grave had been. They had treated it with that same desecration with which they have destroyed 10,000 Indian graves since then. Her bones were scattered in the sand and mud. And from the moment my father saw what had happened, never another sun rose in the heavens for him. His heart had died, yet he went on living, for a time. Mary Standish had bowed her face in her hands. He saw the tremor of her slim shoulders, and when he came back and she looked up at him, it was as if he beheld the pallid beauty of one of the white tundra flowers. And the man who committed that crime was John Graham, she said, in the strangely passionless voice of one who knew what his answer would be. Yes, John Graham. He was there representing big interests in the States. The foreman had objected to what happened. Many of the men had protested. A few of them who knew my father had thrown up their work rather than be partners to that crime. But Graham had the legal power. They say he laughed as if he thought it a great joke that a cabin and a grave should be considered obstacles in his way. And he laughed when my father and I went to see him. Yes, laughed in that noiseless, oily, inside way of his, as you might think of a snake laughing. We found him among the men. My God, you don't know how I hated him. Big, loose, powerful, dangling the watch fob that hung over his vest, and looking at my father in that way as he told him what a fool he was to think a worthless grave should interfere with his work. I wanted to kill him, but my father put a hand on my shoulder, a quiet, steady hand, and said, "It is my duty, Alan, my duty." And then it happened. My father was older, much older than Graham, but God put such strength in him that day as I had never seen before, and with his naked hands he would have killed the brute if I had not unlocked them with my own. Before all his men Graham became a mass of helpless pulp, and from the ground, with the last of the breath that was in him, he cursed my father, and he cursed me. He said that all the days of his life he would follow us until we paid 1,000 times for what we had done. And then my father dragged him as he would have dragged a rat to the edge of a piece of bush, and there he tore his clothes from him until the brute was naked, and in that nakedness he scourged him with whips until his arms were weak, and John Graham was unconscious, and like a great hulk of raw beef. When it was over, we went into the mountains. During the terrible recital, Mary Standish had not looked away from him, and now her hands were clenched like his own, and her eyes and face were aflame, as if she wanted to leap up and strike at something unseen between them. "And after that, Alan? After that?" She did not know that she had spoken his name, and he, hearing it, scarcely understood. "John Graham kept his promise," he answered grimly. "The influence and money behind him haunted us wherever we went. My father had been successful, but one after another the properties in which he was interested were made worthless. A successful mine in which he was most heavily interested was allowed to become abandoned. A hotel, which he partly owned in Dawson, was bankrupted. One after another things happened, and after each happening my father would receive a polite note of regret from Graham, written as if the word actually came from a friend. But my father cared little for money losses now. His heart was drying up and his life ebbing away for the little cabin and the grave that were gone from the foot of the mountain. It went on this way for 3 years, and then, one morning, my father was found on the beach at Nome, dead. Dead? Alan heard only the gasping breath in which the word came from Mary Standish, for he was facing the window, looking steadily away from her. Yes, murdered. I know it was the work of John Graham. He didn't do it personally, but it was his money that accomplished the end. Of course, nothing ever came of it. I won't tell you how his influence and power have dodged me, how they destroyed the first herd of reindeer I had, and how they filled the newspapers with laughter and lies about me when I was down in the States last winter, in an effort to make your people see a little something of the truth about Alaska. I am waiting. I know the day is coming when I shall have John Graham as my father had him under our mountain 20 years ago. He must be 50 now, but that won't save him when the time comes. No one will loosen my hands as I loosen my father's, and all Alaska will rejoice, for his power and his money have become twin monsters that are destroying Alaska just as he destroyed the life of my father. Unless he dies and his money power ends, he will make of this great land nothing more than a shell out of which he and his kind have taken all the meat. And the hour of deadliest danger is now upon us. He looked at Mary Standish, and it was as if death had come to her where she sat. She seemed not to breathe, and her face was so white it frightened him. And then, slowly, she turned her eyes upon him, and never had he seen such living pools of torture and of horror. He was amazed at the quietness of her voice when she began to speak, and startled by the almost deadly coldness of it. "I think you can understand now why I leaped into the sea. Why I wanted the world to think I was dead, and why I have feared to tell you the truth," she said. "I am John Graham's wife." End of chapter 18 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 19 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 19. Alan's first thought was of the monstrous incongruity of the thing, the almost physical impossibility of a mésalliance of the sort Mary Standish had revealed to him. He saw her, young and beautiful, with face and eyes that from the beginning had made him feel all that was good and sweet in life, and behind her he saw the shadow hulk of John Graham, the pitiless Iron Man, without conscience and without soul, coarsened by power, fiendish in his iniquities, and old enough to be her father. A slow smile twisted his lips, but he did not know he smiled. He pulled himself together without letting her see the physical part of the effort it was taking, and he tried to find something to say that would help clear her eyes of the agony that was in them. "That is a most unreasonable thing to be true," he said. It seemed to him his lips were making words out of wood, and that the words were fatuously inefficient compared with what he should have said or acted under the circumstances. She nodded. "It is. But the world doesn't look at it in that way. Such things just happen." She reached for a book which lay on the table, where the tundra daisies were heaped. It was a book written around the early phases of pioneer life in Alaska, taken from his own library, a volume of statistical worth, dryly but carefully written, and she had been reading it. It struck him as a symbol of the fight she was making, of her courage, and of her desire to triumph in the face of tremendous odds that must have beset her. He still could not associate her completely with John Graham. Yet his face was cold and white. Her hand trembled a little as she opened the book and took from it a newspaper clipping. She did not speak as she unfolded it and gave it to him. At the top of two printed columns was the picture of a young and beautiful girl. In an oval covering a small space over the girl's shoulder was a picture of a man of 50 or so. Both were strangers to him. He read their names and then the headlines. $100 million love was the caption, and after the word love was a dollar sign. Youth and age, beauty and the other thing, two great fortunes united. He caught the idea and looked at Mary Standish. It was impossible for him to think of her as Mary Graham. "I tore that from a paper in Cordova," she said. "They have nothing to do with me. The girl lives in Texas. But don't you see something in her eyes? Can't you see it, even in the picture? She has on her wedding things, but it seemed to me, when I saw her face, that in her eyes were agony and despair and hopelessness, and that she was bravely trying to hide them from the world. It's just another proof, one of thousands, that such unreasonable things do happen." He was beginning to feel a dull and painless sort of calm, the stoicism which came to possess him whenever he was confronted by the inevitable. He sat down and, with his head bowed over it, took one of the limp little hands that lay in Mary Standish's lap. The warmth had gone out of it. It was cold and lifeless. He caressed it gently and held it between his brown, muscular hands, staring at it, and yet seeing nothing in particular. It was only the ticking of Keok's clock that broke the silence for a time. Then he released the hand, and it dropped in the girl's lap again. She had been looking steadily at the streak of gray in his hair, and a light came into her eyes, a light which he did not see, and a little tremble of her lips, and an almost imperceptible inclination of her head toward him. "I'm sorry I didn't know," he said. "I realize now how you must have felt back there in the cottonwoods." "No, you don't realize. You don't," she protested. In an instant it seemed to him a vibrant, flaming life swept over her again. It was as if his words had touched fire to some secret thing, as if he had unlocked a door which grim hopelessness had closed. He was amazed at the swiftness with which color came into her cheeks. "You don't understand, and I am determined that you shall," she went on. "I would die before I let you go away thinking what is now in your mind. You will despise me, but I would rather be hated for the truth than because of the horrible thing which you must believe if I remain silent." She forced a wan smile to her lips. "You know, Belinda Mulrooneys were very well in their day, but they don't fit in now, do they? If a woman makes a mistake and tries to remedy it in a fighting sort of way, as Belinda Mulrooney might have done back in the days when Alaska was young." She finished with a little gesture of despair. "I have committed a great folly," she said, hesitating an instant in his silence. "I see very clearly now the course I should have taken. You will advise me that it is still not too late when you have heard what I am going to say. Your face is like a rock." "It is because your tragedy is mine," he said. She turned her eyes from him. The color in her cheeks deepened. It was a vivid, feverish glow. "I was born rich, enormously, hatefully rich," she said in the low, unimpassioned voice of a confessional. "I don't remember father or mother. I lived always with my grandfather Standish and my uncle Peter Standish. Until I was 13 I had my uncle Peter, who was grandfather's brother and lived with us. I worshipped Uncle Peter. He was a cripple. From young manhood he had lived in a wheelchair, and he was nearly 75 when he died. As a baby that wheelchair and my rides in it with him about the great house in which we lived were my delights. He was my father and mother, everything that was good and sweet in life. I remember thinking as a child that if God was as good as Uncle Peter, he was a wonderful God. It was Uncle Peter who told me year after year the old stories and legends of the Standishes, and he was always happy and glad, and seeing nothing but sunshine, though he hadn't stood on his feet for nearly 60 years. And my Uncle Peter died when I was 13, 5 days before my birthday came. I think he must have been to me what your father was to you." He nodded. There was something that was not the hardness of rock in his face now, and John Graham seemed to have faded away. "I was left then alone with my grandfather Standish," she went on. "He didn't love me as Uncle Peter loved me, and I don't think I loved him. But I was proud of him. I thought the whole world must have stood in awe of him, as I did. As I grew older I learned the world was afraid of him. Bankers, presidents, even the strongest men in great financial interests, afraid of him and of his partners, the Grahams, and of Sharpley, who my Uncle Peter had told me was the cleverest lawyer in the nation, and who had grown up in the business of the two families. My grandfather was 68 when Uncle Peter died, so it was John Graham who was the actual working force behind the combined fortunes of the two families. Sometimes, as I now recall it, Uncle Peter was like a little child. I remember how he tried to make me understand just how big my grandfather's interests were by telling me that if $2 were taken from every man, woman and child in the United States, it would just about add up to what he and the Grahams possessed, and my grandfather Standish's interests were 3/4 of the whole. I remember how a haunted look would come into my Uncle Peter's face at times when I asked him how all this money was used, and where it was, and he never answered me as I wanted to be answered, and I never understood. I didn't know why people feared my grandfather and John Graham. I didn't know of the stupendous power my grandfather's money had rolled up for them. I didn't know. Her voice sank to a shuddering whisper. I didn't know how they were using it in Alaska, for instance. I didn't know it was feeding upon starvation and ruin and death. I don't think even Uncle Peter knew that. She looked at Alan steadily, and her grey eyes seemed burning up with a slow fire. Why, even then, before Uncle Peter died, I had become one of the biggest factors in all their schemes. It was impossible for me to suspect that John Graham was anticipating a little girl of 13. And I didn't guess that my grandfather Standish, so straight, so grandly white of beard and hair, so like a god of power when he stood among men, was even then planning that I should be given to him, so that a monumental combination of wealth might increase itself still more in that juggernaut of financial achievement for which he lived. And to bring about my sacrifice, to make sure it would not fail, they set Sharpleigh to the task, because Sharpleigh was sweet and good of face, and gentle like Uncle Peter, so that I loved him and had confidence in him, without a suspicion that under his white hair lay a brain which matched in cunning and mercilessness that of John Graham himself. And he did his work well, Alan. A second time she had spoken his name, softly and without embarrassment. With her nervous fingers tying and untying the two corners of a little handkerchief in her lap, she went on, after a moment of silence in which the ticking of Keogh's clock seemed tense and loud. When I was 17, Grandfather Standish died. I wish you could understand all that followed without my telling you, how I clung to Sharpleigh as a father, how I trusted him, and how cleverly and gently he educated me to the thought that it was right and just, and my greatest duty in life, to carry out the stipulation of my grandfather's will and marry John Graham. Otherwise, he told me, if that union was not brought about before I was 22, not a dollar of the great fortune would go to the house of Standish. And because he was clever enough to know that money alone would not urge me, he showed me a letter which he said my Uncle Peter had written, and which I was to read on my 17th birthday. And in that letter Uncle Peter urged me to live up to the Standish name and join in that union of the two great fortunes which he and Grandfather Standish had always planned. I didn't dream the letter was a forgery, and in the end they won, and I promised. She sat with bowed head, crumpling the bit of cambric between her fingers. "Do you despise me?" she asked. "No," he replied in a tense, unimpassioned voice. "I love you." She tried to look at him calmly and bravely. In his face again lay the immobility of rock, and in his eyes a sullen, slumbering fire. "I promised," she repeated quickly, as if regretting the impulse that had made her ask him the question. "But it was to be business, a cold, unsentimental business. I disliked John Graham, yet I would marry him. In the eyes of the law I would be his wife. In the eyes of the world I would remain his wife,
but never more than that. They agreed, and I, in my ignorance, believed. I didn't see the trap. I didn't see the wicked triumph in John Graham's heart. No power could have made me believe then that he wanted to possess only me, that he was horrible enough to want me even without love, that he was a great monster of a spider, and I the fly lured into his web. And then the agony of it was that in all the years since Uncle Peter died I had dreamt strange and beautiful dreams. I lived in a make-believe world of my own, and I read, and the thought grew stronger and stronger in me that I had lived another life somewhere, and that I belonged back in the years when the world was clean, and there was love and vast reaches of land wherein money and power were little guessed of, and where romance and the glory of manhood and womanhood rose above all other things. Oh, I wanted these things. And yet, because others had moulded me, and because of my misguided Standish sense of pride and honor, I was shackling myself to John Graham. In the last month preceding my 22nd birthday, I learned more of the man than I had ever known before. Rumors came to me. I investigated a little, and I began to find the hatred and the reason for it which has come to me so conclusively here in Alaska. I almost knew at the last that he was a monster, but the world had been told I was to marry him, and Sharpley with his fatherly hypocrisy was behind me, and John Graham treated me so courteously and so coolly that I did not suspect the terrible things in his heart and mind. And I went on with the bargain. I married him. She drew a sudden deep breath, as if she had passed through the ordeal of what she had most dreaded to say, and now, meeting the changeless expression of Alan's face with a fierce little cry that leaped from her like a flash of gunfire, she sprang to her feet and stood with her back crushed against the tundra flowers, her voice trembling as she continued, while he stood up and faced her. "You needn't go on," he interrupted in a voice so low and terrible hard that she felt the menacing thrill of it. "You needn't. I will settle with John Graham if God gives me the chance." "You would have me stop now, before I have told you of the only shred of triumph to which I may lay claim," she protested. "Oh, you may be sure that I realize the sickening folly and wickedness of it all. But I swear before my God that I didn't realize it then, until it was too late. To you, Alan, clean as the great mountains and plains that have been part of you, I know how impossible this must seem. That I should marry a man I at first feared, then loathed, then came to hate with a deadly hatred. That I should sacrifice myself because I thought it was a duty. That I should be so weak, so ignorant, so like soft clay in the hands of those I trusted. Yet I tell you that at no time did I think or suspect that I was sacrificing myself. At no time, blind though you may call me, did I see a hint of that sickening danger into which I was voluntarily going. No, not even an hour before the wedding did I suspect that, for it had all been so coldly planned, like a great deal in finance, so carefully adjudged by us all as a business affair, that I felt no fear except that sickness of soul which comes of giving up one's life, and no hint of it came until the last of the few words were spoken which made us man and wife. And then I saw in John Graham's eyes something which I had never seen before, and sharply. Her hands caught at her breast. Her grey eyes were pools of flame. I went to my room. I didn't lock my door, because never had it been necessary to do that. I didn't cry. No, I didn't cry.
But something strange was happening to me, which tears might have prevented. It seemed to me there were many walls to my room. I was faint. The windows seemed to appear and disappear, and in that sickness I reached my bed. Then I saw the door open, and John Graham came in, and closed the door behind him, and locked it. My room! He had come into my room! The unexpectedness of it, the horror, the insult, roused me from my stupor. I sprang up to face him, and there he stood within arm's reach of me, a look in his face which told me at last the truth which I had failed to suspect or fear. His arms were reaching out. "You are my wife," he said. Oh, I knew then. "You are my wife," he repeated. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. And then his arms reached me. I felt them crushing around me like the coils of a great snake. The poison of his lips was at my face, and I believed that I was lost, and that no power could save me in this hour from the man who had come to my room, the man who was my husband. I think it was Uncle Peter who gave me voice, who put the right words in my brain, who made me laugh, yes, laugh, and almost caress him with my hands. The change in me amazed him, stunned him, and he freed me, while I told him that in these first few hours of wifehood I wanted to be alone, and that he should come to me that evening, and that I would be waiting for him. And I smiled at him as I said these things, smiled while I wanted to kill him. And he went, a great, gloating, triumphant beast, believing that the obedience of wifehood was about to give him what he had expected to find through dishonor, and I was left alone. I thought of only one thing then, escape. I saw the truth. It swept over me, inundated me, roared in my ears. All that I had ever lived with Uncle Peter came back to me. This was not his world. It had never been, and it was not mine. It was, all at once, a world of monsters. I wanted never to face it again, never to look into the eyes of those I had known. And even as these thoughts and desires swept upon me, I was filling a traveling bag in a fever of madness, and Uncle Peter was at my side, urging me to hurry, telling me I had no minutes to lose. For the man who had left me was clever, and might guess the truth that lay hid behind my smiles and cajolery. I stole out through the back of the house, and as I went I heard Sharpleigh's low laughter in the library. It was a new kind of laughter, and with it I heard John Graham's voice. I was thinking only of the sea, to get away on the sea. A taxi took me to my bank, and I drew money. I went to the wharves, intent only on boarding a ship, any ship, and it seemed to me that Uncle Peter was leading me, and we came to a great ship that was leaving for Alaska, and you know what happened then, Alan Holt." With a sob she bowed her face in her hands, but only an instant it was there. And when she looked at Alan again, there were no tears in her eyes, but a soft glory of pride and exultation. "I'm clean of John Graham," she cried, "clean." He stood twisting his hands, twisting them in a helpless, futile sort of way, and it was he and not the girl who felt like bowing his head that the tears might come unseen. For her eyes were bright and shining and clear as stars. "Do you despise me now?" "I love you," he said again, and made no movement toward her. "I am glad," she whispered, and she did not look at him, but at the sunlit plain which lay beyond the window. "And Rossland was on the Nome and saw you and sent word back to Graham?" he said, fighting to keep himself from going nearer to her. She nodded. "Yes, and so I came to you.
and failing there I leaped into the sea, for I wanted them to think I was dead. And Rossland was hurt. Yes, strangely. I heard of it in Cordova. Men like Rossland frequently come to unexpected ends. He went to the door which she had closed, and opened it, and stood looking toward the blue billows of the foothills, with the white crests of the mountains behind them. She came after a moment and stood beside him. "I understand," she said softly, and her hand lay in a gentle touch upon his arm. "You are trying to see some way out, and you can see only one. That is to go back, face the creatures I hate, regain my freedom in the old way. And I, too, can see no other way. I came on impulse. I must return with impulse and madness burned out of me. And I am sorry. I dread it. I would rather die." "And I," he began, then caught himself and pointed to the distant hills and mountains. "The herds are there," he said. "I am going to them. I may be gone a week or more. Will you promise me to be here when I return?" "Yes, if that is your desire." "It is." She was so near that his lips might have touched her shining hair. "And when you return I must go? That will be the only way." "I think so." "It will be hard. It may be after all that I am a coward, but to face all that alone." "You won't be alone," he said quietly, still looking at the faraway hills. "If you go, I am going with you." It seemed as if she had stopped breathing for a moment at his side, and then, with a little sobbing cry, she drew away from him and stood at the half-opened door of Nawadlook's room. And the glory in her eyes was the glory of his dreams, as if he had wandered with her hand in hand over the tundras in those days of grief and half-madness when he had thought she was dead. "I am glad I was in Ellen McCormick's cabin the day you came," she was saying. "And I thank God for giving me the madness and courage to come to you. I am not afraid of anything in the world now, because I love you, Alan." And as Nawadlook's door closed behind her, Alan stumbled out into the sunlight, a great drumming in his heart and a tumult in his brain that twisted the world about him until for a little it held neither vision nor space nor sound. End of chapter 19 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 20 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 20. In that way, with the beautiful world swimming in sunshine and golden tundra haze until foothills and mountains were like castles in a dream, Alan Holt set off with Tautuk and Amuk Toolik, leaving Stampede and Keok and Nawadlook at the coral bars, with Stampede little regretting that he was left behind to guard the range. For a mighty resolution had taken root in the prospector's heart, and he felt himself thrilled and a bit trembling at the nearness of the greatest drama that had ever entered his life. Alan, looking back after the first few minutes, saw that Keok and Nawadlook stood alone. Stampede was gone. The ridge beyond the coulee, out of which Mary Standish had come with wild flowers, soon closed like a door between him and Sokwenna's cabin,
and the straight trail to the mountains lay ahead, and over this Alan set the pace with Tautuk and Amuk Toolik and a caravan of 7 pack deer behind him bearing supplies for the herdsmen. Alan had scarcely spoken to the 2 men. He knew the driving force which was sending him to the mountains was not only an impulse, but almost an inspirational thing born of necessity. Each step that he took, with his head and heart in a swirl of intoxicating madness, was an effort behind which he was putting a sheer weight of physical will. He wanted to go back. The urge was upon him to surrender utterly to the weakness of forgetting that Mary Standish was a wife. He had almost fallen a victim to his selfishness and passion in the moment when she stood at Nawadlook's door, telling him that she loved him. An iron hand had drawn him out into the day, and it was the same iron hand that kept his face to the mountains now, while in his brain her voice repeated the words that had set his world on fire. He knew what had happened this morning was not the merely important and essential incident of most human lives. It had been a cataclysmic thing with him. Probably it would be impossible for even the girl ever fully to understand. And he needed to be alone to gather strength and mental calmness for the meeting of the problem ahead of him. A complication so unexpected that the very foundation of that stoic equanimity which the mountains had bred in him had suffered a temporary upsetting. His happiness was almost an insanity. The dream wherein he had wandered with the spirit of the dead had come true. It was the old idol in the flesh again. His father, his mother, and back in the cabin beyond the ridge such a love had cried out to him. And he was afraid to return. He laughed the fact aloud, happily and with an unrepressed exultation as he strode ahead of the pack train. And with that exultation words came to his lips, words intended for himself alone, telling him that Mary Standish belonged to him, and that until the end of eternity he would fight for her and keep her. Yet he kept on facing the mountains, and he walked so swiftly that Tautuk and Amuk Toolik fell steadily behind with the deer, so that in time long dips and swells of the tundra lay between them. With grim persistence he kept at himself, and at last there swept over him in its ultimate triumph a compelling sense of the justice of what he had done. Justice to Mary Standish. Even now he did not think of her as Mary Graham, but she was Graham's wife. And if he had gone to her in that moment of glorious confession when she had stood at Nawadlook's door, if he had violated her faith when, because of faith, she had laid the world at his feet, he would have fallen to the level of John Graham himself. Thought of the narrowness of his escape, and of the first mad desire to call her back from Nawadlook's room, to hold her in his arms again as he had held her in the cottonwoods, brought a hot fire into his face. Something greater than his own fighting instinct had turned him to the open door of the cabin. It was Mary Standish, her courage, the glory of faith and love shining in her eyes, her measurement of him as a man. She had not been afraid to say what was in her heart, because she knew what he would do. Mid-afternoon found him waiting for Tautuk and Amuk Toolik at the edge of a slough where willows grew deep and green and the crested billows of sedge cotton stood knee-high. The faces of the herdsmen were sweating. Thereafter Alan walked with them, until in that hour when the sun had sunk to its lowest plane they came to the first of the Endicott foothills. Here they rested until the coolness of deeper evening, when a golden twilight filled the land, and then resumed the journey toward the mountains. Midsummer heat and the winged pests of the lower lands had driven the herds steadily into the cooler altitudes of the higher plateaux and valleys. Here they had split into telescoping columns, which drifted in slowly moving streams wherever the doors of the hills and mountains opened into new grazing fields, until Alan's 10,000 reindeer were in 3 divisions, 2 of the greatest traveling westward, and 1 of 1,000 head working north and east. The first and second days Alan remained with the nearest and southward herd. The third day he went on with Tautuk and 2 pack deer through a break in the mountains and joined the herdsmen of the second and higher multitude of feeding animals. There began to possess him a curious disinclination to hurry, and this aversion grew in a direct ratio with the thought which was becoming stronger in him with each mile and hour of his progress. A multitude of emotions were buried under the conviction that Mary Standish must leave the range when he returned. He had a grim sense of honor, and a particularly devout one when it had to do with women, and though he conceded nothing of right and justice in the relationship which existed between the woman he loved and John Graham, he knew that she must go. To remain at the range was the one impossible thing for her to do. He would take her to Tanana. He would go with her to the States. The matter would be settled in a reasonable and intelligent way, and when he came back he would bring her with him. But beneath this undercurrent of decision fought the thing which his will held down, and yet never quite throttled completely. That something which urged him with an unconquerable persistence to hold with his own hands what a glorious fate had given him, and to finish with John Graham, if it ever came to that, in the madly desirable way he visioned for himself in those occasional moments when the fires of temptation blazed hottest. The 4th night he said to Tautuk, "If Keok should marry another man, what would you do?" It was a moment before Tautuk looked at him, and in the herdsman's eyes was a wild mute question, as if suddenly there had leaped into his stolid mind a suspicion which had never come to him before. Alan laid a reassuring hand upon his arm. "I don't mean she's going to, Tautuk," he laughed. "She loves you, I know it. Only you are so stupid and so slow and so hopeless as a lover that she's punishing you while she has the right, before she marries you. But if she should marry someone else, what would you do?" "My brother?" asked Tautuk. "No." "A relative?" "No." "A friend?" "No, a stranger. Someone who had injured you. For instance, someone Keok hated and who had cheated her into marrying him." "I would kill him," said Tautuk quietly. It was this night the temptation was strongest upon Alan. Why should Mary Standish go back, he asked himself. She had surrendered everything to escape from the horror down there. She had given up fortune and friends. She had scattered convention to the 4 winds, had gambled her life in the hazard, and in the end had come to him. Why should he not keep her? John Graham and the world believed she was dead, and he was master here. If some day Graham should happen to cross his path, he would settle the matter in Tautuk's way. Later, while Tautuk slept and the world lay about him in a soft glow, and the valley below was filled with misty billows of twilight, out of which came to him faintly the curious crackling sound of reindeer hoofs and the grunting contentment of the feeding herd, the reaction came, as he had known it would come in the end. The morning of the 5th day he set out alone for the eastward herd, and on the 6th overtook Tatpan and his herdsmen.
Tatpan, like Sokwenna's foster children Keok and Nawadlook, had a quarter strain of white in him, and when Alan came up to him in the edge of the valley where the deer were grazing, he was lying on a rock playing Yankee Doodle on a mouth organ. It was Tatpan who told him that an hour or two before an exhausted stranger had come into camp, looking for him, and that the man was asleep now, apparently more dead than alive, but had given instructions to be awakened at the end of 2 hours, and not a minute later. Together they had a look at him. He was a small, ruddy-faced man with a carroty blonde hair and a peculiarly boyish appearance as he lay doubled up like a jackknife, profoundly asleep. Tatpan looked at his big silver watch, and in a low voice described how the stranger had stumbled into camp, so tired he could scarcely put one foot ahead of the other, and that he had dropped down where he now lay when he learned Alan was with one of the other herds. "He must have come a long distance," said Tatpan, "and he has travelled fast." Something familiar about the man grew upon Alan. Yet he could not place him. He wore a gun which he had unbelted and placed within reach of his hand on the grass. His chin was pugnaciously prominent, and in sleep the mysterious stranger had crooked a forefinger and thumb about his revolver in a way that spoke of caution and experience. "If he is in such a hurry to see me, you might awaken him," said Alan. He turned a little aside and knelt to drink in a tiny stream of water that ran down from the snowy summits, and he could hear Tatpan rousing the stranger. By the time he had finished drinking and faced about, the little man with the carroty blonde hair was on his feet. Alan stared, and the little man grinned. His ruddy cheeks grew pinker, his blue eyes twinkled, and in what seemed to be a moment of embarrassment he gave his gun a sudden snap that drew an exclamation of amazement from Alan. Only one man in the world had he ever seen throw a gun into its holster like that. A sickly grin began to spread over his own countenance, and all at once Tatpan's eyes began to bulge. "Stampede!" he cried. Stampede rubbed a hand over his smooth, prominent chin and nodded apologetically. "It is me," he conceded. "I had to do it. It was give one or the other up, my whiskers or her. They went hard too. I flipped dice and the whiskers won. I cut cards and the whiskers won. I played Klondike agin 'em and the whiskers busted the bank. Then I got mad and shaved 'em. Do I look so bad, Alan?" "You look 20 years younger," declared Alan, stifling his desire to laugh when he saw the other's seriousness. Stampede was thoughtfully stroking his chin. "Then why the devil did they laugh?" he demanded. "Mary Standish didn't laugh. She cried, just stood and cried, and then sat down and cried. She thought I was that blamed funny. And Keok laughed until she was sick and had to go to bed. That little devil of a Keok calls me Pinky now. And Miss Standish says it wasn't because I was funny that she laughed, but that the change in me was so sudden she couldn't help it. Nawadlook says I've got a characterful chin." Alan gripped his hand, and a swift change came over Stampede's face. A steely glitter shot into the blue of his eyes, and his chin hardened. Nature no longer disguised the Stampede Smith of other days, and Alan felt a new thrill and a new regard for the man whose hand he held. This, at last, was the man whose name had gone before him up and down the old trails, the man whose cool and calculating courage, whose fearlessness of death and quickness with a gun had written pages in Alaskan history which would never be forgotten.
Where his first impulse had been to laugh, he now felt the grim thrill and admiration of men of other days, who, when in Stampede's presence, knew they were in the presence of a master. The old Stampede had come to life again, and Alan knew why. The grip of his hand tightened, and Stampede returned it. "Some day, if we are lucky, there always comes a woman to make the world worth living in, Stampede," he said. "There does," replied Stampede. He looked steadily at Alan. "And I take it you love Mary Standish," he added, "and that you'd fight for her if you had to?" "I would," said Alan. "Then it's time you were traveling," advised Stampede significantly. "I've been 12 hours on the trail without a rest. She told me to move fast, and I've moved. I mean Mary Standish. She said it was almost a matter of life and death that I find you in a hurry. I wanted to stay, but she wouldn't let me. It's you she wants. Rossland is at the range." "Rossland?" "Yes, Rossland. And it's my guess John Graham isn't far away. I smell happenings, Alan. We'd better hurry." End of chapter 20 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 21 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 21. Stampede had started with one of the 2 saddle deer left at the range. But to ride deer back successfully and with any degree of speed and specific direction was an accomplishment which he had neglected, and within the first half dozen miles he had abandoned the adventure to continue his journey on foot. As Tatpan had no saddle deer in his herd, and the swiftest messenger would require many hours in which to reach Amuk Toolik, Alan set out for his range within half an hour after his arrival at Tatpan's camp. Stampede, declaring himself a new man after his brief rest and the meal which followed it, would not listen to Alan's advice that he follow later, when he was more refreshed. A fierce and reminiscent gleam smoldered in the little gunfighter's eyes as he watched Alan during the first half-hour leg of their race through the foothills to the tundras. Alan did not observe it, or the grimness that had settled in the face behind him. His own mind was undergoing an upheaval of conjecture and wild questioning. That Rossland had discovered Mary Standish was not dead was the least astonishing factor in the new development. The information might easily have reached him through Sandy McCormick or his wife Ellen. The astonishing thing was that he had in some mysterious way picked up the trail of her flight 1,000 miles northward, and the still more amazing fact that he had dared to follow her and reveal himself openly at his range. His heart pumped hard, for he knew Rossland must be directly under Graham's orders. Then came the resolution to take Stampede into his confidence and to reveal all that had happened on the day of his departure for the mountains. He proceeded to do this without equivocation or hesitancy, for there now pressed upon him a grim anticipation of impending events ahead of them. Stampede betrayed no astonishment at the other's disclosures. The smoldering fire remained in his eyes, the immobility of his face unchanged. Only when Alan repeated in his own words Mary Standish's confession of love at Nawadlook's door did the fighting lines soften about his comrade's eyes and mouth.
Stampede's lips responded with an oddly quizzical smile. "I knew that a long time ago," he said. "I guessed it that first night of storm in the coach up Chitina. I knew it for certain before we left Tanana. She didn't tell me, but I wasn't blind. It was the note that puzzled and frightened me, the note she stuffed in her slipper. And Rossland told me before I left that going for you was a wild goose chase, as he intended to take Mrs. John Graham back with him immediately." "And you left her alone after that?" Stampede shrugged his shoulders as he valiantly kept up with Alan's suddenly quickened pace. "She insisted, said it meant life and death for her. And she looked it, white as paper after her talk with Rossland. Besides—" "What?" "Sokwenna won't sleep until we get back. He knows. I told him. And he's watching from the garret window with a .303 Savage. I saw him pick off a duck the other day at 200 yards." They hurried on. After a little, Alan said, with a fear which he could not name clutching at his heart, "Why did you say Graham might not be far away?" "In my bones," replied Stampede, his face hard as rock again. "In my bones." "Is that all?" "Not quite. I think Rossland told her. She was so white, and her hand cold as a lump of clay when she put it on mine. It was in her eyes, too. Besides, Rossland has taken possession of your cabin as though he owns it. I take it that means somebody behind him, a force, something big to reckon with. He asked me how many men we had. I told him, stretching it a little. He grinned. He couldn't keep back that grin. It was as if a devil in him slipped out from hiding for an instant." Suddenly he caught Alan's arm and stopped him. His chin shot out. The sweat ran from his face. For a full quarter of a minute the two men stared at each other. "Alan, we're short-sighted. I'm damned if I don't think we ought to call the herdsman in, and every man with a loaded gun." "You think it's that bad?" "Might be, if Graham's behind Rossland and has men with him." "We are 2.5 hours from Tatpan," said Alan in a cold, unemotional voice. "He has only half a dozen men with him, and it will take at least 4 to make quick work in finding Tautuk and Amuk Toolik. There are 18 men with the southward herd and 22 with the upper. I mean counting the boys. Use your own judgment. All are armed. It may be foolish, but I'm following your hunch." They gripped hands. "It's more than a hunch," Alan breathed Stampede softly. "And for God's sake, keep off the music as long as you can." He was gone, and as his agile, boyish figure started in a half-run toward the foothills, Alan set his face southward, so that in a quarter of an hour they were lost to each other in the undulating distance of the tundra. Never had Alan traveled as on the last of this 6th day of his absence from the range. He was comparatively fresh, as his trail to Tatpan's camp had not been an exhausting one, and his more intimate knowledge of the country gave him a decided advantage over Stampede. He believed he could make the distance in 10 hours, but to this he would be compelled to add a rest of at least 3 or 4 hours during the night. It was now 8 o'clock. By 9 or 10 the next morning he would be facing Rossland, and at about the same hour Tatpan's swift messengers would be closing in about Tautuk and Amuk Toolik. He knew the speed with which his herdsmen would sweep out of the mountains and over the tundras. 2 years ago Amuk Toolik and a dozen of his Eskimo people had traveled 52 hours without rest or food, covering 119 miles in that time. His blood flushed hot with pride. He couldn't do that, But his people could, and would. He could see them sweeping in from the telescoping segments of the herds as the word went among them. He could see them streaking out of the foothills, and then, like wolves scattering for free air and leg room, he saw them dotting the tundra in their race for home and war, if it was war that lay ahead of them. Twilight began to creep in upon him, like veils of cool, dry mist out of the horizons. And hour after hour he went on, eating a strip of pemmican when he grew hungry, and drinking in the spring coulees when he came to them, where the water was cold and clear. Not until a telltale cramp began to bite warningly in his leg did he stop for the rest which he knew he must take. It was 1 o'clock. Counting his journey to Tatpan's camp, he had been traveling almost steadily for 17 hours. Not until he stretched himself out on his back in a grassy hollow where a little stream a foot wide rippled close to his ears did he realize how tired he had become. At first he tried not to sleep. Rest was all he wanted. He dared not close his eyes, but exhaustion overcame him at last, and he slept. When he awoke, bird song and the sun were taunting him. He sat up with a jerk, then leaped for his feet in alarm. His watch told the story. He had slept soundly for 6 hours, instead of resting 3 or 4 with his eyes open. After a little, as he hurried on his way, he did not altogether regret what had happened. He felt like a fighting man. He breathed deeply, ate a breakfast of pemmican as he walked, and proceeded to make up lost time. The interval between 15 minutes of 12 and 12 he almost ran. The quarter of an hour brought him to the crest of the ridge, from which he could look upon the buildings of the range. Nothing had happened that he could see. He gave a great gasp of relief, and in his joy he laughed. The strangeness of the laugh told him more than anything else the tension he had been under. Another half hour, and he came up out of the dip behind Sokwenna's cabin and tried the door. It was locked. A voice answered his knock, and he called out his name. The bolt shot back, the door opened, and he stepped in. Nawadlook stood at her bedroom door, a gun in her hands. Keok faced him, holding grimly to a long knife, and between them, staring white-faced at him as he entered, was Mary Standish. She came forward to meet him, and he heard a whisper from Nawadlook and saw Keok follow her swiftly through the door into the other room. Mary Standish held out her hands to him a little blindly, and the tremble in her throat and the look in her eyes betrayed the struggle she was making to keep from breaking down and crying out in gladness at his coming. It was that look that sent a flood of joy into his heart, even when he saw the torture and hopelessness behind it. He held her hands close, and into her eyes he smiled in such a way that he saw them widen, as if she almost disbelieved. And then she drew in a sudden quick breath, and her fingers clung to him. It was as if the hope that had deserted her came in an instant into her face again. He was not excited, he was not even perturbed, now that he saw that light in her eyes and knew she was safe. But his love was there. She saw it and felt the force of it behind the deadly calmness with which he was smiling at her. She gave a little sob, so low it was scarcely more than a broken breath, a little cry that came of wonder, understanding, and unspeakable faith in this man who was smiling at her so confidently in the face of the tragedy that had come to destroy her. "Rossland is in your cabin," she whispered, "and John Graham is back there somewhere, coming this way. Rossland says if I don't go to him of my own free will." He felt the shudder that ran through her. "I understand the rest," he said. They stood silent for a moment. The grey-cheeked thrush was singing on the roof. Then, as if she had been a child, he took her face between his hands and bent her head back a little, so that he was looking straight into her eyes, and so near that he could feel the sweet warmth of her breath. "You didn't make a mistake the day I went away?" he asked. "You love me?" "Yes." For a moment longer he looked into her eyes. Then he stood back from her. Even Keok and Nawadlook heard his laugh. It was strange, they thought, Keok with her knife and Nawadlook with her gun, for the bird was singing and Alan Holt was laughing, and Mary Standish was very still. Another moment later, from where he sat cross-legged at the little window in the attic, keeping his unsleeping vigil with a rifle across his knees, old Sokwenna saw his master walk across the open, and something in the manner of his going brought back a vision of another day long ago, when Ghost Kloof had rung with the cries of battle, and the hands now gnarled and twisted with age had played their part in the heroic stand of his people against the oppressors from the farther north. Then he saw Alan go into the cabin where Rossland was, and softly his fingers drummed upon the ancient tom-tom which lay at his side. His eyes fixed themselves upon the distant mountains, and under his breath he mumbled the old chant of battle, dead and forgotten except in Sokwenna's brain, and after that his eyes closed, and again the vision grew out of darkness like a picture for him, a vision of twisting trails and of fighting men gathering with their faces set for war. End of chapter 21 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.
Chapter 22 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 22. At the desk in Alan's living room sat Rossland, when the door opened behind him and the master of the range came in. He was not disturbed when he saw who it was, and rose to meet him. His coat was off, his sleeves rolled up, and it was evident that he was making no effort to conceal his freedom with Alan's books and papers. He advanced, holding out a hand. This was not the same Rossland who told Alan to attend to his own business on board the Nome. His attitude was that of one greeting a friend, smiling and affable even before he spoke. Something inspired Alan to return the smile. Behind that smile he was admiring the man's nerve. His hand met Rossland's casually, but there was no uncertainty in the warmth of the other's grip. "How do you do, Paris, old boy?" he greeted good-humouredly. "Saw you going into Helen a few minutes ago, so I've been waiting for you. She's a little frightened, and we can't blame her. Menelaus is mightily upset. But mind me, Holt, I'm not blaming you. I'm too good a sport. Clever, I call it. Damned clever. She's enough to turn any man's head. I only wish I were in your boots right now. I'd have turned traitor myself aboard the Nome if she had shown an inclination." He proffered a cigar, a big fat cigar with a gold band. It was inspiration again that made Alan accept it and light it. His blood was racing, but Rossland saw nothing of that. He observed only the nod, the cool smile on Alan's lips, the apparent nonchalance with which he was meeting the situation. It pleased Graham's agent. He reseated himself in the desk chair and motioned Alan to another chair near him. "I thought you were badly hurt," said Alan. "Nasty knife wound you got." Rossland shrugged his shoulders. "There you have it again, Holt, the hell of letting a pretty face run away with you. One of the Thlinkit girls down in the steerage, you know. Lovely little thing, wasn't she? Tricked her into my cabin all right, but she wasn't like some other Indian girls I've known. The next night a brother, or sweetheart, or whoever it was, got me through the open port. It wasn't bad. I was out of the hospital within a week. Lucky I was put there, too. Otherwise I wouldn't have seen Mrs. Graham one morning through the window. What a little our fortunes hang to at times, eh? If it hadn't been for the girl and the knife and the hospital, I wouldn't be here now, and Graham wouldn't be bleeding his heart out with impatience, and you, Holt, wouldn't be facing the biggest opportunity that will ever come into your life." "I'm afraid I don't understand," said Alan, hiding his face in the smoke of his cigar, and speaking with an apparent indifference which had its effect upon Rossland. "Your presence inclines me to believe that luck has rather turned against me. Where can my advantage be?" A grim seriousness settled into Rossland's eyes, and his voice became cool and hard. "Holt, as two men who are not afraid to meet unusual situations, we may as well call a spade in this matter. Don't you think so?" "Decidedly," said Alan. "You know that Mary Standish is really Mary Standish Graham, John Graham's wife?" "Yes." "And you probably know now why she jumped into the sea, and why she ran away from Graham?" "I do." "That saves a lot of talk. But there is another side to the story which you probably don't know, and I am here to tell it to you. John Graham doesn't care for a dollar of the Standish fortune. It's the girl he wants, and has always wanted. She has grown up under his eyes. From the day she was 14 years old he has lived and planned with the thought of possessing her. You know how he got her to marry him, and you know what happened afterward. But it makes no difference to him whether she hates him or not. He wants her, and this," he swept his arms out, "is the most beautiful place in the world in which to have her returned to him. I've been figuring from your books. Your property isn't worth over $100,000 as it stands on hoof today. I'm here to offer you 5 times that for it. In other words, Graham is willing to forfeit all action he might have personally against you for stealing his wife, and in place of that will pay you $500,000 for the privilege of having his honeymoon here, and making of this place a country estate where his wife may reside indefinitely, subject to her husband's visits when he is so inclined. There will be a stipulation, of course, requiring that the personal details of the deal be kept strictly confidential, and that you leave the country. Do I make myself clear?" Alan rose to his feet and paced thoughtfully across the room. At least Rossland measured his action as one of sudden, intensive reflection as he watched him, smiling complacently at the effect of his knockout proposition upon the other. He had not minced matters. He had come to the point without an effort at bargaining, and he possessed sufficient dramatic sense to appreciate what the offer of $500,000 meant to an individual who was struggling for existence at the edge of a raw frontier. Alan stood with his back toward him, facing a window. His voice was oddly strained when he answered, but that was quite natural too, Rossland thought. "I am wondering if I understand you," he said. "Do you mean that if I sell Graham the range, leave it bag and baggage, and agree to keep my mouth shut thereafter, he will give me $500,000? "That is the price. You are to take your people with you. Graham has his own." Alan tried to laugh. "I think I see the point now. He isn't paying $500,000 for Miss Standish, I mean Mrs. Graham. He's paying it for the isolation." "Exactly. It was a last-minute hunch with him to settle the matter peaceably. We started up here to get his wife. You understand, to get her, and settled the matter with you in a different way from the one we're using now. You hit the word when you said isolation. What a damned fool a man can make of himself over a pretty face. Think of it, $500,000. "It sounds unreal," mused Alan, keeping his face to the window. "Why should he offer so much?" "You must keep the stipulation in mind, Holt. That is an important part of the deal. You are to keep your mouth shut. Buying the range at a normal price wouldn't guarantee it. But when you accept a sum like that, you are a partner in the other end of the transaction, and your health depends upon keeping the matter quiet. Simple enough, isn't it?" Alan turned back to the table. His face was pale. He tried to keep smoke in front of his eyes. Of course, I don't suppose he'd allow Mrs. Graham to escape back to the States, where she might do a little upsetting on her own account. He isn't throwing the money away, replied Rossland significantly. She should remain here indefinitely? Indefinitely. Probably would never return. Strange how squarely you hit the nail on the head. Why should she return? The world believes she is dead. Papers were full of it. The little secret of her being alive is all our own. And this will be a beautiful summering place for Graham. Magnificent climate. Lovely flowers, birds, and the girl he has watched grow up and wanted since she was 14. And who hates him. True. Who was tricked into marrying him, and who would rather die than live with him as his wife. But it's up to Graham to keep her alive, Holt. That's not our business. If she dies, I imagine you will have an opportunity to get your range back pretty cheap. Rossland held a paper out to Alan. Here's partial payment, 250,000. I have the papers here on the desk ready to sign. As soon as you give possession, I'll return to Tanana with you and make the remaining payment. Alan took the check. I guess only a fool would refuse an offer like this, Rossland. Yes, only a fool. And I am that fool. So quietly did Alan speak that for an instant the significance of his words did not fall with full force upon Rossland. The smoke cleared away from before Alan's face. His cigar dropped to the floor, and he stepped on it with his foot. The check followed it in torn scraps. The fury he had held back with almost superhuman effort blazed in his eyes. If I could have Graham where you are now, in that chair, I'd give 10 years of my life, Rossland. I would kill him. And you... He stepped back a pace, as if to put himself out of striking distance of the beast who was staring at him in amazement. What you have said about her should condemn you to death, and I would kill you here in this room, if it wasn't necessary for you to take my message back to Graham. Tell him that Mary Standish, not Mary Graham, is as pure and clean and as sweet as the day she was born. Tell him that she belongs to me. I love her. She is mine. Do you understand? And all the money in the world couldn't buy one hair from her head. I am going to take her back to the States. She is going to get a square deal, and the world is going to know her story. She has nothing to conceal. Absolutely nothing. Tell that to John Graham for me. He advanced upon Rossland, who had risen from his chair. His hands were clenched, his face a mask of iron. Get out! Go, before I flay you within an inch of your rotten life. The energy which every fibre in him yearned to expend upon Rossland sent the table crashing back in an overturned wreck against the wall. Go, before I kill you. He was advancing, even as the words of warning came from his lips, and the man before him, an awe-stricken mass of flesh that had forgotten power and courage in the face of a deadly and unexpected menace, backed quickly to the door and escaped. He made for the corrals, and Alan watched from his door until he saw him departing southward, accompanied by 2 men who bore packs on their shoulders. Not until then did Rossland gather his nerves sufficiently to stop and look back. His breathless voice carried something unintelligible to Alan, but he did not return for his coat and hat. The reaction came to Alan when he saw the wreck he had made of the table. Another moment or two and the devil in him would have been at work. He hated Rossland. He hated him now only a little less than he hated John Graham, and that he had let him go seemed a miracle to him. He felt the strain he had been under, but he was glad. Some little god of common sense had overruled his passion, and he had acted wisely. Graham would now get his message, and there would be no misunderstanding of purpose between them. He was staring at the disordered paper on his desk when a movement at the door turned him about. Mary Standish stood before him. "You sent him away?" she cried softly. Her eyes were shining, her lips parted, her face lit up with a beautiful glow. She saw the overturned table, Rossland's hat and coat on a chair, the evidence of what had happened and the quickness of his flight. And then she turned her face to Alan again, and what he saw broke down the last of that grim resolution which he had measured for himself, so that in a moment he was at her side and had her in his arms. She made no effort to free herself as she had done in the cottonwoods, but turned her mouth up for him to kiss, and then hid her face against his shoulder, while he, fighting vainly to find utterance for the 1,000 words in his throat, stood stroking her hair, and then buried his face in it, crying out at last in the warm sweetness of it that he loved her and was going to fight for her, and that no power on earth could take her away from him now. And these things he repeated until she raised her flushed face from his breast, and let him kiss her lips once more, and then freed herself gently from his arms. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of the Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian Hoos. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 23. For a space they stood apart, and in the radiant loveliness of Mary Standish's face, and in Alan's quiet and unimpassioned attitude, were neither shame nor regret. In a moment they had swept aside the barrier which convention had raised against them, and now they felt the inevitable thrill of joy and triumph, and not the humiliating embarrassment of dishonor. They made no effort to draw a curtain upon their happiness, or to hide the swift heartbeat of it from each other. It had happened, and they were glad. Yet they stood apart, and something pressed upon Alan the inviolableness of the little freedom of space between them, of its sacredness to Mary Standish, and darker and deeper grew the glory of pride and faith that lay with the love in her eyes when he did not cross it. He reached out his hand, and freely she gave him her own. Lips blushing with his kisses trembled in a smile, and she bowed her head a little, so that he was looking at her smooth hair, soft and sweet where he had caressed it a few moments before. "I thank God," he said. He did not finish the surge of gratitude that was in his heart. Speech seemed trivial, even futile, but she understood. He was not thanking God for that moment, but for a lifetime of something that at last had come to him. This, it seemed to him, was the end of a world as he had known it, the beginning of a new. He stepped back, and his hands trembled. For something to do, he set up the overturned table, and Mary Standish watched him with a quiet, satisfied wonder. She loved him, and she had come into his arms. She had given him her lips to kiss, and he laughed softly as he came to her side again and looked over the tundra where Rosalind had gone. "How long before you can prepare for the journey?" he asked. "You mean that we must start tonight or in the morning?" "I think we shall go through the cottonwoods over the trail to Nome. Unless Rosalind lied, Graham is somewhere out there on the Tanana Trail." Her hand pressed his arm. "We are going back, is that it, Alan?" "Yes, to Seattle. It is the one thing to do. You are not afraid?" "With you there, no." "And you will return with me when it is over?" He was looking steadily ahead, over the tundra, but he felt her cheek touch his shoulder, lightly as a feather. "Yes, I will come back with you." "And you will be ready?" "I am ready now." The sun-fire of the plains danced in his eyes, a cobweb of golden mist rising out of the earth, beckoning wraiths and undulating visions, the breath of life, of warmth, of growing things, all between him and the hidden cottonwoods, a joyous sea into which he wanted to plunge without another minute of waiting. As he felt the gentle touch of her cheek against his shoulder and the weight of her hand on his arm, that she had come to him utterly was in the low surrender of her voice. She had ceased to fight. She had given to him the precious right to fight for her. It was this sense of her need and of her glorious faith in him and of the obligation pressing with it that drove slowly back into him the grimmer realities of the day. Its horror surged upon him again, and the significance of what Rossland had said seemed fresher, clearer, even more terrible now that he was gone. Unconsciously, the old lines of hatred crept into his face again as he looked steadily in the direction of which the other man had taken, and he wondered how much of that same horror, of the unbelievable menace stealing upon her, Rossland had divulged to the girl who stood so quietly now at his side. Had he done right to let him go? Should he not have killed him as he would have exterminated a serpent? For Rossland had exulted. He was of Graham's flesh and desires, a part of his foul soul, a defiler of womanhood, and the one who had bargained to make possible the opportunity for an indescribable crime. It was not too late. He could still overtake him out there in the hollows of the tundra. The pressure on his arm tightened. He looked down. Mary Standish had seen what was in his face, and there was something in her calmness that brought him to himself. He knew in that moment that Rossland had told her a great deal, yet she was not afraid, unless it was a fear of what had been in his mind. "I am ready," she reminded him. "We must wait for Stampede," he said, reason returning to him. "He should be here sometime tonight or in the morning. Now that Rossland is off my nerves, I can see how necessary it is to have someone like Stampede between us and—" He did not finish, but what he had intended to say was quite clear to her. She stood in the doorway, and he felt an almost uncontrollable desire to take her in his arms again. "He is between here and Tanana," she said with a little gesture of her head. "Rossland told you that?" "Yes, and there are others with him, so many that he was amused when I told him you would not let them take me away." "Then you were not afraid that I might let them have you?" "I have always been sure of what you would do since I opened that second letter at Ellen McCormick's, Alan." He caught the flash of her eyes, the gladness in them, and she was gone before he could find another word to say. Keok and Nawadlook were still approaching hesitantly, but now they hurried to meet her, Keok still grimly clutching the long knife. And beyond them, at the little window under the roof, he saw the ghostly face of old Sokwina, like a death's head on guard. His blood ran a little faster. The emptiness of the tundras, the illimitable spaces without sign of human life, the vast stage waiting for its impending drama, with its sunshine, its song of birds, its whisper and breath of growing flowers, struck a new note in him, and he looked again at the little window where Sokwina sat like a spirit from another world, warning him in his silent and lifeless stare of something menacing and deadly creeping upon them out of that space which seemed so free of all evil. He beckoned to him and then entered his cabin, waiting while Sokwina crawled down from his post and came hobbling over the open, a crooked figure, bent like a baboon, witch-like in his great age, yet with sunken eyes that gleamed like little points of flame, and a quickness of movement that made Alan shiver as he watched him through the window. In a moment the old man entered. He was mumbling. He was saying in that jumble of sound which it was difficult for even Alan to understand, and which Sokwina had never given up for the missionary's teachings, that he could hear feet and smell blood, and that the feet were many, and the blood was near, and that both smell and footfall were coming from the old kloof where the yellow skulls still lay, dripping with the water that had once run red. Alan was one of the few who, by reason of much effort, had learned the story of the kloof from old Sokwina, how so long ago that Sokwina was a young man, a hostile tribe had descended upon his people, killing the men and stealing the women, and how at last Sokwina and a handful of his tribesmen fled south with what women were left, and made a final stand in the kloof. And there, on a day that was golden and filled with the beauty of birdsong and flowers, had ambushed their enemies and killed them to a man. All were dead now, all but Sokwina. For a space Alan was sorry he had called Sokwina to his cabin. He was no longer the cheerful and gentle old man of his people, the old man who chortled with joy at the prettiness and play of Keok and Nawadlook, who loved birds and flowers and little children, and who had retained an impish boyhood along with his great age. He was changed. He stood before Alan, an embodiment of fatalism, mumbling incoherent things in his breath, a spirit of evil omen lurking in his sunken eyes, and his thin hands gripping like bird claws to his rifle. Alan threw off the uncomfortable feeling that he had gripped him for a moment and set him to an appointed task, the watching of the southward plain from the crest of the tall ridge 2 miles back on the Tanana Trail. He was to return when the sun reached its horizon. Alan was inspired now by a great caution, a growing premonition which stirred him with uneasiness, and he began his own preparations as soon as Sokwenna had started on his mission. The desire to leave at once, without the delay of an hour, pulled strong in him, but he forced himself to see the folly of such haste. He would be away many months, possibly a year this time. There was much to do, a mass of detail to attend to, a volume of instructions and advice to leave behind him. He must at least see Stampede, and it was necessary to write down certain laws for Tautuk and Amuktulik. As this work of preparation progressed, and the premonition persisted in remaining with him, he fell into a habit of repeating to himself the absurdity of fears and the impossibility of danger. He tried to make himself feel uncomfortably foolish at the thought of having ordered the herdsman in. In all probability Graham would not appear at all, he told himself, or at least not for many days or weeks. And if he did come, it would be to war in a legal way, and not with murder. Yet his uneasiness did not leave him. As the hours passed and the afternoon lengthened, the invisible something urged him more strongly to take the trail beyond the cottonwoods, with Mary Standish at his side. Twice he saw her between noon and 5 o'clock, and by that time his writing was done. He looked at his guns carefully. He saw that his favorite rifle and automatic were working smoothly, and he called himself a fool for filling his ammunition vest with an extravagant number of cartridges. He even carried an amount of this ammunition and 2 of his extra guns to Sokwenna's cabin, with the thought that it was this cabin on the edge of the ravine which was best fitted for defense in the event of necessity. Possibly Stampede might have use for it and for the guns if Graham should come after he and Mary were well on their way to Nome. After supper, when the sun was throwing long shadows from the edge of the horizon, Alan came from a final survey of his cabin and the food which Wagarak had prepared for his pack, and found Mary at the edge of the ravine, watching the twilight gathering where the coulee ran narrower and deeper between the distant breasts of the tundra. "I'm going to leave you for a little while," he said, "but Sokwenna has returned, and you will not be alone." "Where are you going?" "As far as the cottonwoods, I think." "Then I am going with you." "I expect to walk very fast." "Not faster than I, Alan." "But I want to make sure the country is clear in that direction before twilight shuts out the distances." "I will help you." Her hand crept into his. "I am going with you, Alan," she repeated. "Yes, I think you are," he laughed joyously, and suddenly he bent his head and pressed her hand to his lips, and in that way, with her hand in his, they set out over the trail which they had not traveled together since the day he had come from Nome. There was a warm glow in her face, and something beautifully soft and sweet in her eyes, which she did not try to keep away from him. It made him forget the cottonwoods and the plains beyond, and his caution, and Sokwenna's advice to guard carefully against the hiding places of Ghost Kloof and the country beyond. "I have been thinking a great deal today," she was saying, "because you have left me so much alone. I have been thinking of you, and my thoughts have given me a wonderful happiness." "And I have been in paradise," he replied. "You do not think that I am wicked?" "I could sooner believe the sun would never come up again." "Nor that I have been unwomanly?" "You are my dream of all that is glorious in womanhood." "Yet I have followed you, have thrust myself at you, fairly at your head, Alan." "For which I thank God," he breathed devoutly. "And I have told you that I love you, and you have taken me in your arms and have kissed me." "Yes." "And I am walking now with my hand in yours." "And will continue to do so if I can hold it." "And I am another man's wife," she shuddered. "You are mine," he declared doggedly. "You know it, and the Almighty God knows it. It is blasphemy to speak of yourself as Graham's wife. You are legally entangled with him, and that is all. Heart and soul and body you are free." "No, I am not free." "But you are." And then, after a moment, she whispered at his shoulder, "Alan, because you are the finest gentleman in all the world, I will tell you why I am not. It is because, heart and soul, I belong to you." He dared not look at her, and feeling the struggle within him, Mary Standish looked straight ahead with a wonderful smile on her lips, and repeated softly, "Yes, the very finest gentleman in all the world." Over the breasts of the tundra and the hollows between them they went, still hand in hand, and found themselves talking of the colorings of the sky and the birds and the flowers and the twilight creeping in about them, while Alan scanned the shortening horizons for a sign of human life. 1 mile, and then another, and after that a third, and they were looking into gray gloom far ahead, where lay the kloof. It was strange that he should think of the letter now, the letter he had written to Ellen McCormick. But think of it he did, and said what was in his mind to Mary Standish, who was also looking with him into the wall of gloom that lay between them and the distant cottonwoods. "It seemed to me that I was not writing to her, but to you," he said, "and I think that if you hadn't come back to me, I would have gone mad." "I have the letter. It is here," and she placed a hand upon her breast. "Do you remember what you wrote, Alan? That you meant more to me than life, and that particularly you wanted Ellen McCormick to keep a tress of my hair for you if they found me." He nodded. "When I sat across the table from you aboard the Nome, I worshipped it and didn't know it. And since then, since I've had you here every time I've looked at you—" He stopped, choking the words back in his throat. "Say it, Alan." "I wanted to see it down," he finished desperately. "Silly notion, isn't it?" "Why is it?" she asked, her eyes widening a little. "If you love it, why is it a silly notion to want to see it down?" "Why, I thought possibly you might think so," he added lamely. Never had he heard anything sweeter than her laughter as she turned suddenly from him, so that the glow of the fallen sun was at her back, and with deft, swift fingers began loosening the coils of her hair until its radiant masses tumbled about her, streaming down her back in a silken glory that awed him with its beauty, and drew from his lips a cry of gladness. She faced him, and in her eyes was the shining softness that glowed in her hair. "Do you think it is nice, Alan?" He went to her and filled his hands with the heavy tresses and pressed them to his lips and face. Thus he stood when he felt the sudden shiver that ran through her. It was like a little shock. He heard the catch of her breath, and the hand which she had placed gently on his bowed head fell suddenly away. When he raised his head to look at her, she was staring past him into the deepening twilight of the tundra, and it seemed as if something had stricken her so that for a space she was powerless to speak or move. "What is it?" he cried, and whirled about, straining his eyes to see what had alarmed her. And as he looked, a deep, swift shadow sped over the earth, darkening the mellow twilight until it was a somber gloom of night, and the midnight sun went out like a great luminous lamp as a dense wall of purple cloud rolled up in an impenetrable curtain between it and the Arctic world. Often he had seen this happen in the approach of a summer storm on the tundras, but never had the change seemed so swift as now. Where there had been golden light, he saw his companion's face now pale in a sea of dusk. It was this miracle of Arctic night, its suddenness and unexpectedness, that had startled her, he thought, and he laughed softly. But her hand clutched his arm. "I saw them," she cried, her voice breaking. "I saw them out there against the sun, before the cloud came, and some of them were running like animals." "Shadows!" he exclaimed. "The long shadows of foxes running against the sun, or of the big gray rabbits, or of a wolf and her half-grown sneaking away." "No, no, they were not that," she breathed tensely, and her fingers clung more fiercely to his arm. "They were not shadows. They were men." End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Roger Moline. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 24. In the moment of stillness between them, when their hearts seemed to have stopped beating that they might not lose the faintest whispering of the twilight, a sound came to Alan, and he knew it was the toe of a boot striking against stone. Not a foot in his tribe would have made that sound, none but Stampede Smith's or his own. "Were they many?" he asked. "I could not see. The sun was darkening, but 5 or 6 were running—" "Behind us?" "Yes." "And they saw us?" "I think so. It was but a moment, and they were a part of the dusk." He found her hand and held it closely. Her fingers clung to his, and he could hear her quick breathing as he unbuttoned the flap of his automatic holster. "You think they have come?" she whispered, and a cold dread was in her voice. "Possibly. My people would not appear from that direction. You are not afraid?" "No, no, I am not afraid." "Yet you are trembling." "It is this strange gloom, Alan." Never had the Arctic twilight gone more completely. Not half a dozen times had he seen the phenomenon in all his years in the tundras, where thunderstorm and the putting out of the summer sun until twilight thickens into the gloom of near night is an occurrence so rare that it is more awesome than the weirdest play of the northern lights. It seemed to him now that what was happening was a miracle, the play of a mighty hand opening their way to salvation. An inky wall was shutting out the world where the glow of the midnight sun should have been. It was spreading quickly. Shadows became part of the gloom, and this gloom crept in, thickening, drawing nearer, until the tundra was a weird chaos, neither night nor twilight, challenging vision until eyes strained futilely to penetrate its mystery. And as it gathered about them, enveloping them in their own narrowing circle of vision, Alan was thinking quickly. It had taken him only a moment to accept the significance of the running figures his companion had seen. Graham's men were near, had seen them, and were getting between them and the range. Possibly it was a scouting party, and if there were no more than 5 or 6, the number which Mary had counted, he was quite sure of the situation. But there might be a dozen or 50 of them. It was possible Graham and Rossland were advancing upon the range with their entire force. He had at no time tried to analyze just what this force might be, except to assure himself that with the overwhelming influence behind him, both political and financial, and fired by a passion for Mary Standish that had revealed itself as little short of madness, Graham would hesitate at no convention of law or humanity to achieve his end. Probably he was playing the game so that he would be shielded by the technicalities of the law if it came to a tragic end. His gunmen would undoubtedly be impelled to a certain extent by an idea of authority. For Graham was an injured husband rescuing his wife, while he, Alan Holt, was the woman's abductor and paramour, and a fit subject to be shot upon sight. His free hand gripped the butt of his pistol as he led the way straight ahead. The sudden gloom helped to hide in his face the horror he felt of what that rescue would mean to Mary Standish. And then a cold and deadly definiteness possessed him, and every nerve in his body gathered itself in readiness for whatever might happen. If Graham's men had seen them and were getting between them and retreat, the neck of the trap lay ahead, and in this direction Alan walked so swiftly that the girl was almost running at his side. He could not hear her footsteps, so lightly they fell. Her fingers were twined about his own, and he could feel the silken caress of her loose hair. For half a mile he kept on, watching for a moving shadow, listening for a sound. Then he stopped. He drew Mary into his arms and held her there, so that her head lay against his breast. She was panting, and he could feel and hear her thumping heart. He found her parted lips and kissed them. "You are not afraid?" he asked again. Her head made a fierce little negative movement against his breast. "No." He laughed softly at the beautiful courage with which he lied. "Even if they saw us, and are Graham's men, we have given them the slip," he comforted her. Now we will circle eastward back to the range. I am sorry I hurried you so. We will go more slowly." "We must travel faster," she insisted. "I want to run." Her fingers sought his hand and clung to it again as they set out. At intervals they stopped, staring about them into nothingness, and listening. Twice Alan thought he heard sounds which did not belong to the night. The second time the little fingers tightened about his own, but his companion said no word, only her breath seemed to catch in her throat for an instant. At the end of another half hour it was growing lighter, yet the breath of storm seemed nearer. The cool promise of it touched their cheeks, and about them were gathering whispers and eddies of a thirsty earth rousing to the sudden change. It was lighter because the wall of cloud seemed to be distributing itself over the whole heaven, thinning out where its solid opaqueness had lain against the sun. Alan could see the girl's face and the cloud of her hair. Hollows and ridges of the tundra were taking more distinct shape when they came into a dip, and Alan recognized a thicket of willows behind which a pool was hidden. The thicket was only half a mile from home. A spring was near the edge of the willows, and to this he led the girl, made her a place to kneel, and showed her how to cup the cool water in the palms of her hands. While she inclined her head to drink, he held back her hair and rested with his lips pressed to it. He heard the trickle of water running between her fingers, her little laugh of half pleasure, half fear, which in another instant broke into a startled scream as he half gained his feet to meet the crashing body that catapulted at him from the concealment of the willows. A greater commotion in the thicket followed the attack, then another voice, crying out sharply, a second cry from Mary Standish, and he found himself on his knees, twisted backward and fighting desperately to loosen a pair of gigantic hands at his throat. He could hear the girl struggling, but she did not cry out again. In an instant, it seemed, his brain was reeling. He was conscious of a futile effort to reach his gun, and could see the face over him, grim and horrible in the gloom, as the merciless hands choked the life from him. Then he heard a shout, a loud shout, filled with triumph and exultation as he was thrown back. His head seemed leaving his shoulders. His body crumbled, and almost spasmodically his legs shot out with the last strength that was in him. He was scarcely aware of the great gasp that followed, but the fingers loosened at his throat, the face disappeared, and the man who was killing him sank back. For a precious moment or two Alan did not move as he drew great breaths of air into his lungs. Then he felt for his pistol. The holster was empty. He could hear the panting of the girl, her sobbing breath very near him, and life and strength leaped back into his body. The man who had choked him was advancing again, on hands and knees. In a flash Alan was up and on him like a lithe cat. His fist beat into a bearded face. He called out to Mary as he struck, and through his blows saw her where she had fallen to her knees, with a second hulk bending over her, almost in the water of the little spring from which she had been drinking. A mad curse leaped from his lips. He was ready to kill now. He wanted to kill, to destroy what was already under his hands, that he might leap upon this other beast, who stood over Mary Standish, his hands twisted in her long hair. Dazed by blows that fell with the force of a club, the bearded man's head sagged backward, and Alan's fingers dug into his throat. It was a bull's neck. He tried to break it. 10 seconds, 20, half a minute at the most, and flesh and bone would have given way, but before the bearded man's gasping cry was gone from his lips, the second figure leaped upon Alan. He had no time to defend himself from this new attack. His strength was half gone, and a terrific blow sent him reeling. Blindly he reached out and grappled. Not until his arms met those of his fresh assailant did he realize how much of himself he had expended upon the other. A sickening horror filled his soul as he felt his weakness, and an involuntary moan broke from his lips. Even then he would have cut out his tongue to have silenced that sound, to have kept it from the girl. She was creeping on her hands and knees, but he could not see. Her long hair trailed in the trampled earth and in the muddied water of the spring, and her hands were groping, groping, until they found what they were seeking. Then she rose to her feet, carrying the rock on which one of her hands had rested when she knelt to drink. The bearded man, bringing himself to his knees, reached out drunkenly. But she avoided him and poised herself over Alan and his assailant. The rock descended. Alan saw her then. He heard the one swift, terrible blow, and his enemy rolled away from him, limply and without sound. He staggered to his feet and for a moment caught the swaying girl in his arms. The bearded man was rising. He was half on his feet when Alan was at his throat again, and they went down together. The girl heard blows, then a heavier one, and with an exclamation of triumph Alan stood up. By chance his hand had come in contact with his fallen pistol. He clicked the safety down. He was ready to shoot, ready to continue the fight with a gun. "Come," he said. His voice was gasping, strangely unreal and thick. She came to him and put her hand on his again, and it was wet and sticky with tundra mud from the spring. Then they climbed to the swell of the plain, away from the pool and the willows. In the air about them, creeping up from the outer darkness of the strange twilight, were clearer whispers now, and with these sounds of storm, borne from the west, came a hallooing voice. It was answered from straight ahead. Alan held the muddied little hand closer in his own and set out for the range houses from which direction the last voice had come. He knew what was happening. Graham's men were cleverer than he had supposed. They had encircled the tundra side of the range, and some of them were closing in on the willow pool from which the triumphant shout of the bearded man's companion had come. They were wondering why the call was not repeated, and were hallooing. Every nerve in Alan's body was concentrated for swift and terrible action, for the desperateness of their situation had surged upon him like a breath of fire, unbelievable and yet true. Back at the willows they would have killed him. The hands at his throat had sought his life. Wolves, and not men, were about them on the plain, wolves headed by two monsters of the human pack, Graham and Rossland. Murder and lust and mad passion were hidden in the darkness. Law and order and civilization were hundreds of miles away. If Graham won, only the unmapped tundras would remember this night, as the deep, dark kloof remembered in its gloom the other tragedy of more than half a century ago. And the girl at his side, already disheveled and muddied by their hands, his mind could go no farther, and angry protest broke in a low cry from his lips. The girl thought it was because of the shadows that loomed up suddenly in their path. There were two of them, and she too cried out as voices commanded them to stop. Alan caught a swift up-movement of an arm, but his own was quicker. 3 spurts of flame darted in lightning flashes from his pistol, and the man who had raised his arm crumpled to the earth, while the other dissolved swiftly into the storm gloom. A moment later his wild shouts were assembling the pack, while the detonations of Alan's pistol continued to roll over the tundra. The unexpectedness of the shots, their tragic effect, the falling of the stricken man and the flight of the other, brought no word from Mary Standish. But her breath was sobbing, and in the lifting of the purplish gloom she turned her face for an instant to Alan, tensely white, with wide open eyes. Her hair covered her like a shining veil, and where it clustered in a disheveled mass upon her breast, Alan saw her hand thrusting itself forward from its clinging concealment, and in it, to his amazement, was a pistol. He recognized the weapon, one of a brace of light automatics which his friend, Carl Loman, had presented to him several Christmas seasons ago. Pride and a strange exultation swept over him. Until now she had concealed the weapon, but all along she had prepared to fight with him against their enemies. He wanted to stop and take her in his arms, and with his kisses tell her how splendid she was. But instead of this he sped more swiftly ahead, and they came into a niggerhead bottom which lay in a narrow barrier between them and the range. Through this ran a trail scarcely wider than a wagon track, made through the sea of hummocks and sedge bowls and mucky pitfalls by the axes and shovels of his people. Finding this, Alan stopped for a moment, knowing that safety lay ahead of them. The girl leaned against him, and then was almost a dead weight in his arms. The last 200 yards had taken the strength from her body. Her pale face dropped back, and Alan brushed the soft hair away from it, and kissed her lips and her eyes, while the pistol lay clenched against his breast. Even then, too hard run to speak, she smiled at him, and Alan caught her up in his arms and darted into the narrow path which he knew their pursuers would not immediately find if they could bet beyond their vision. He was joyously amazed at her lightness. She was like a child in his arms, a glorious little goddess hidden and smothered in her long hair, and he held her closer as he hurried toward the cabins, conscious of the soft tightening of her arms about his neck, feeling the sweet caress of her panting breath, strengthened and made happy by her helplessness. Thus they came out of the bottom as the first mist of slowly approaching rain touched his face. He could see farther now, halfway back over the narrow trail. He climbed a slope, and here Mary Standish slipped from his arms and stood with new strength, looking into his face. His breath was coming in little breaks, and he pointed. Faintly they could make out the shadows of the corral buildings. Beyond them were no lights penetrating the gloom from the windows of the range of houses. The silence of the place was deathlike. And then something grew out of the earth almost at their feet. A hollow cry followed the movement, a cry that was ghostly and shivering, and loud enough only for them to hear, and Sokwenna stood at their side. He talked swiftly. Only Alan understood. There was something unearthly and spectral in his appearance. His hair and beard were wet. His eyes shot here and there in little points of fire. He was like a gnome, weirdly uncanny as he gestured and talked in his monotone while he watched the niggerhead bottom. When he had finished, he did not wait for an answer, but turned and led the way swiftly toward the range houses. "What did he say?" asked the girl. "That he is glad we are back. He heard the shots and came to meet us." "And what else?" she persisted. "Old Sokwenna is superstitious and nervous. He said some things that you wouldn't understand. You would probably think him mad if he told you the spirits of his comrades slain in the kloof many years ago were here with him tonight, warning him of the things about to happen. Anyway, he has been cautious. No sooner were we out of sight than he hustled every woman and child in the village on their way to the mountains. Keok and Nawadlook wouldn't go. I'm glad of that, for if they were pursued and overtaken by men like Graham and Rossland—" "Death would be better," finished Mary Standish, and her hand clung more tightly to his arm. "Yes, I think so. But that cannot happen now. Out in the open they had us at a disadvantage, but we can hold Sokwenna's place until Stampede and the herdsmen come. With 2 good rifles inside, they won't dare to assault the cabin with their naked hands. The advantage is all ours now. We can shoot, but they won't risk the use of their rifles."
"Why?"
"Because you will be inside. Graham wants you alive, not dead. And bullets—" They had reached Sokwenna's door, and in that moment they hesitated and turned their faces back to the gloom out of which they had fled. Voices came suddenly from beyond the corrals. There was no effort at concealment. The buildings were discovered, and men called out loudly and were answered from half a dozen points out on the tundra. They could hear running feet and sharp commands. Some were cursing where they were tangled among the niggerheads, and the sound of hurrying foes came from the edge of the ravine. Alan's heart stood still. There was something terribly swift and businesslike in this gathering of their enemies. He could hear them at his cabin. Doors opened. A window fell in with a crash. Lights flared up through the gray mist. It was then, from the barricaded attic window over their heads, that Sokwenna's rifle answered. A single shot, a shriek, and then a pale stream of flame leaped out from the window as the old warrior emptied his gun. Before the last of the 5 swift shots were fired, Alan was in the cabin, barring the door behind him. Shaded candles burned on the floor, and beside them crouched Keok and Nawadlook. A glance told him what Sokwenna had done. The room was an arsenal. Guns lay there, ready to be used. Heaps of cartridges were piled near them, and the eyes of Keok and Nawadlook blazed deep and steady fires as they held shining cartridges between their fingers, ready to thrust them into the rifle chambers as fast as the guns were emptied. In the center of the room stood Mary Standish. The candles, shaded so that they would not disclose the windows, faintly illuminated her pale face and unbound hair, and revealed the horror in her eyes as she looked at Alan. He was about to speak, to assure her that there was no danger that Graham's men would fire upon the cabin, when hell broke suddenly loose out in the night. The savage roar of guns answered Sokwenna's fusillade, and a hail of bullets crashed against the log walls. 2 of them found their way through the windows like hissing serpents, and with a single movement Alan was at Mary's side and had crumpled her down on the floor beside Keok and Nawadlook. His face was white, his brain a furnace of sudden, consuming fire. "I thought they wouldn't shoot at women," he said, and his voice was terrifying in its strange hardness. "I was mistaken, and I am sure now that I understand." With his rifle he cautiously approached the window. He was no longer guessing at an elusive truth. He knew what Graham was thinking, what he was planning, what he intended to do, and the thing was appalling. Both he and Rossland knew there would be some way of sheltering Mary Standish in Sokwenna's cabin. They were accepting a desperate gamble, believing that Alan Holt would find a safe place for her, while he fought until he fell. It was the finesse of clever scheming, nothing less than murder, and he, by this combination of circumstances and plot, was the victim marked for death. The shooting had stopped, and the silence that followed it held a significance for Alan. They were giving him an allotted time in which to care for those under his protection. A trap door was in the floor of Sokwenna's cabin. It opened into a small storeroom and cellar, which in turn possessed an air vent leading to the outside, overlooking the ravine. In the candle glow Alan saw the door of this trap propped open with a stick. Sokwenna, too, was clever. Sokwenna had foreseen. Crouched under the window, he looked at the girls. Keok, with the rifle in her hand, had crept to the foot of the ladder leading up to the attic and began to climb it. She was going to Sokwenna, to load for him. Alan pointed to the open trap. "Quick, let's get into that," he cried. "It is the only safe place. You can load there and hand out the guns." Mary Standish looked at him steadily, but did not move. She was clutching a rifle in her hands, and Nawadlook did not move, but Keok climbed steadily and disappeared in the darkness above. "Go into the cellar," commanded Alan. "Good God, if you don't—" A smile lit up Mary's face. In that hour of deadly peril it was like a ray of glorious light leading the way through blackness, a smile sweet and gentle and unafraid, and slowly she crept toward Alan, dragging the rifle in one hand and holding the little pistol in the other, and from his feet she still smiled up at him through the dishevelment of her shining hair, and in the quiet little voice that thrilled him she said, "I am going to help you fight." Nawadlook came creeping after her, dragging another rifle and bearing an apron heavy with the weight of cartridges. And above, through the darkened loophole of the attic window, Sokwenna's ferret eyes had caught the movement of a shadow in the gray mist, and his rifle sent its death challenge once more to John Graham and his men. What followed struck a smile from Mary's lips, and a moaning sob rose from her breast as she watched the man she loved rise up before the open window to face the winged death that was again beating a tattoo against the log walls of the cabin. End of chapter 24. Read by Roger Moline. Chapter 25 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Roger Moline. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 25. That in the lust and passion of his designs and the arrogance of his power, John Graham was not afraid to overstep all law and order, and that he believed Holt would shelter Mary Standish from injury and death, there could no longer be a doubt after the first few swift moments following Sokwenna's rifle shots from the attic window. Through the window of the lower room, barricaded by the cautious old warrior until its aperture was not more than 8 inches square, Alan thrust his rifle as the crash of gunfire broke the gray and thickening mist of night. He could hear the thud and hiss of bullets. He heard them singing like angry bees as they passed with the swiftness of chain lightning over the cabin roof, and their patter against the log walls was like the hollow drumming of knuckles against the side of a ripe watermelon. There was something fascinating and almost gentle about that last sound. It did not seem that the horror of death was riding with it, and Alan lost all sense of fear as he stared in the direction from which the firing came, trying to make out shadows at which to shoot. Here and there he saw dim, white streaks, and at these he fired as fast as he could throw cartridges into the chamber and pull the trigger. Then he crouched down with the empty gun. It was Mary Standish who held out a freshly loaded weapon to him. Her face was waxen in its deathly pallor. Her eyes, staring at him so strangely, never for an instant leaving his face, were lustrous with the agony of fear that flamed in their depths. She was not afraid for herself. It was for him. His name was on her lips, a whisper unspoken, a breathless prayer, and in that instant a bullet sped through the opening in front of which he had stood a moment before. A hissing, writhing serpent of death that struck something behind them in its venomous wrath. With a cry she flung up her arms about his bent head. "My God, they will kill you if you stand there," she moaned. "Give me up to them, Alan. If you love me, give me up." A sudden spurt of white dust shot out into the dim candle glow, and then another, so near Nawadlook that his blood went cold. Bullets were finding their way through the moss and earth chinking between the logs of the cabin. His arms closed in a fierce embrace about the girl's slim body, and before she could realize what was happening, he leaped to the trap with her and almost flung her into its protection. Then he forced Nawadlook down beside her, and after them he thrust in the empty gun and the apron with its weight of cartridges. His face was demonic in its command. "If you don't stay there, I'll open the door and go outside to fight. Do you understand? Stay there." His clenched fist was in their faces, his voice almost a shout. He saw another white spurt of dust. The bullet crashed in tinware, and following the crash came a shriek from Keok in the attic. In that upper gloom Sokwenna's gun had fallen with a clatter. The old warrior bent himself over, nearly double, and with his 2 withered hands was clutching his stomach. He was on his knees, and his breath suddenly came in a panting, gasping cry. Then he straightened slowly and said something reassuring to Keok, and faced the window again with the gun which she had loaded for him. The scream had scarcely gone from Keok's lips when Alan was at the top of the ladder, calling her. She came to him through the stark blackness of the room, sobbing that Sokwenna was hit, and Alan reached out and seized her and dragged her down and placed her with Nawadlook and Mary Standish. From them he turned to the window, and his soul cried out madly for the power to see, to kill, to avenge. As if in answer to this prayer for light and vision, he saw his cabin strangely illuminated. Dancing, yellow radiance silhouetted the windows, and a stream of it billowed out through an open door into the night. It was so bright he could see the rain mist, scarcely heavier than a dense, slowly descending fog, a wet blanket of vapor moistening the earth. His heart jumped as with each second the blaze of light increased. They had set fire to his cabin. They were no longer white men, but savages. He was terribly cool, even as his heart throbbed so violently. He watched with the eyes of a deadly hunter, wide open over his rifle barrel. Sokwenna was still. Probably he was dead. Keok was sobbing in the cellar pit. Then he saw a shape growing in the illumination, 3 or 4 of them, moving, alive. He waited until they were clearer, and he knew what they were thinking, that the bullet-riddled cabin had lost its power to fight. He prayed God it was Graham he was aiming at, and fired. The figure went down, sank into the earth as a dead man falls. Steadily he fired at the others. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 out of the 4 he hit, and the exultant thought flashed upon him that it was good shooting under the circumstances. He sprang back for another gun, and it was Mary who was waiting for him, head and shoulders out of the cellar pit, the rifle in her hands. She was sobbing as she looked straight at him, yet without moisture or tears in her eyes. "Keep down," he warned. "Keep down below the floor." He guessed what was coming. He had shown his enemies that life still existed in the cabin, life with death in its hands, and now, from the shelter of the other cabins, from the darkness, from beyond the light of his flaming home, the rifle fire continued to grow until it filled the night with a horrible din. He flung himself face down upon the floor so that the lower log of the building protected him. No living thing could have stood up against what was happening in these moments. Bullets tore through the windows and between the moss-chinked logs, crashing against metal and glass and tinware. One of the candles sputtered and went out. And in this hell Alan heard a cry and saw Mary Standish coming out of the cellar pit toward him. He had flung himself down quickly, and she thought he was hit. He shrieked at her, and his heart froze with horror as he saw a heavy tress of her hair drop to the floor as she stood there in that frightful moment, white and glorious in the face of the gunfire. Before she could move another step, he was at her side, and with her in his arms leaped into the pit. A bullet sang over them. He crushed her so close that for a breath or two life seemed to leave her body. A sudden draught of cool air struck his face. He missed Nawadlook. In the deeper gloom farther under the floor he heard her moving and saw a faint square of light. She was creeping back. Her hands touched his arm. "We can get away. There!" she cried in a low voice. "I have opened the little door. We can crawl through it and into the ravine." Her words and the square of light were an inspiration. He had not dreamed that Graham would turn the cabin into a death hole, and Nawadlook's words filled him with a sudden thrilling hope. The rifle fire was dying away again as he gave voice to his plan in sharp, swift words. He would hold the cabin. As long as he was there, Graham and his men would not dare to rush it. At least they would hesitate a considerable time before doing that. And meanwhile the girls could steal down into the ravine. There was no one on that side to intercept them, and both Keok and Nawadlook were well acquainted with the trails into the mountains. It would mean safety for them. He would remain in the cabin and fight until Stampede Smith and the herdsmen came. The white face against his breast was cold and almost expressionless. Something in it frightened him. He knew his argument had failed and that Mary Standish would not go, yet she did not answer him, nor did her lips move in the effort. "Go, for their sakes, if not for your own and mine," he insisted, holding her away from him. "Good God, think what it would mean if beasts like those out there get hold of Keok and Nawadlook. Graham is your husband and will protect you for himself, but for them there will be no hope, no salvation, nothing but a fate more terrible than death. They will be like two beautiful lambs thrown among wolves, broken, destroyed." Her eyes were burning with horror. Keok was sobbing, and a moan which she bravely tried to smother in her breast came from Nawadlook. "And you?" whispered Mary. "I must remain here. It is the only way." Dumbly she allowed him to lead her back with Keok and Nawadlook. Keok went through the opening first, then Nawadlook, and Mary Standish last. She did not touch him again. She made no movement toward him and said no word, and all he remembered of her when she was gone in the gloom was her eyes. In that last look she had given him her soul, and no whisper, no farewell caress came with it. "Go cautiously until you are out of the ravine, then hurry toward the mountains," were his last words. He saw their forms fade into dim shadows, and the gray mist swallowed them. He hurried back, seized a loaded gun, and sprang to the window, knowing that he must continue to deal death until he was killed. Only in that way could he hold Graham back and give those who had escaped a chance for their lives. Cautiously he looked out over his gun barrel. His cabin was a furnace red with flame. Streams of fire were licking out at the windows and through the door, and as he sought vainly for a movement of life, the crackling roar of it came to his ears, and so swiftly that his breath choked him. The pitch-filled walls became sheets of conflagration until the cabin was a seething, red-hot torch of fire whose illumination was more dazzling than the sun of day. Out into this illumination suddenly stalked a figure waving a white sheet at the end of a long pole. It advanced slowly, a little hesitatingly at first, as if doubtful of what might happen, and then it stopped, full in the light, an easy mark for a rifle aimed from Sokwenna's cabin. He saw who it was then, and drew in his rifle and watched the unexpected maneuver in amazement. The man was Rossland. In spite of the dramatic tenseness of the moment, Alan could not repress the grim smile that came to his lips. Rossland was a man of illogical resource, he meditated. Only a short time ago he had fled ignominiously through fear of personal violence, while now, with a courage that could not fail to rouse admiration, he was exposing himself to a swift and sudden death, protected only by the symbol of truce over his head. That he owed this symbol either regard or honor did not for an instant possess Alan. A murderer held it, a man even more vile than a murderer if such a creature existed on earth, and for such a man death was a righteous end. Only Rossland's nerve, and what he might have to say, held back the vengeance within reach of Alan's hand. He waited, and Rossland again advanced and did not stop until he was within 100 feet of the cabin. A sudden, disturbing thought flashed upon Alan as he heard his name called. He had seen no other figures, no other shadows beyond Rossland, and the burning cabin now clearly illuminated the windows of Sokwenna's place. Was it conceivable that Rossland was merely a lure, and the instant he exposed himself in a parley of score of hidden rifles would reveal their treachery? He shuddered and held himself below the opening of the window. Graham and his men were more than capable of such a crime. Rossland's voice rose above the crackle and roar of the burning cabin. "Alan Holt, are you there?" "Yes, I am here," shouted Alan. "And I have a line on your heart, Rossland, and my finger is on the trigger. What do you want?" There was a moment of silence, as if the thought of what he was facing had at last stricken Rossland dumb. Then he said, "We are giving you a last chance, Holt. For God's sake, don't be a fool. The offer I made you today is still good. If you don't accept it, the law must take its course." "The law!" Alan's voice was a savage cry. "Yes, the law. The law is with us. We have the proper authority to recover a stolen wife, a captive, a prisoner held in restraint with felonious intent. But we don't want to press the law unless we are forced to do so. You and the old Eskimo have killed 3 of our men and wounded 2 others. That means the hangman if we take you alive. But we are willing to forget that if you will accept the offer I made you today. What do you say?" Alan was stunned. Speech failed him as he realized the monstrous assurance with which Graham and Rossland were playing their game. And when he made no answer, Rossland continued to drive home his arguments, believing that at last Alan was at the point of surrender. Up in the dark attic the voices had come like ghostland whispers to old Sequenna. He lay huddled at the window, and the chill of death was creeping over him. But the voices roused him. They were not strange voices, but voices which came up out of the past of many years ago, calling upon him, urging him, persisting in his ears with cries of vengeance and of triumph, the call of familiar names, a moaning of women, a sobbing of children. Shadowy hands helped him, and a last time he raised himself to the window, and his eyes were filled with the glare of the burning cabin. He struggled to lift his rifle, and behind him he heard the exultation of his people as he rested it over the sill, and with gasping breath leveled it at something which moved between him and the blazing light of that wonderful sun which was the burning cabin. And then, slowly and with difficulty, he pressed the trigger, and Sequenna's last shot sped on its mission. At the sound of the shot, Alan looked through the window. For a moment Rossland stood motionless. Then the pole in his hands wavered, drooped, and fell to the earth, and Rossland sank down after it, making no sound, and lay a dark and huddled blot on the ground. The appalling swiftness and ease with which Rossland had passed from life into death shocked every nerve in Alan's body. Horror for a brief space stupefied him, and he continued to stare at the dark and motionless blot, forgetful of his own danger, while a grim and terrible silence followed the shot. And then what seemed to be a single cry broke that silence, though it was made up of many men's voices. Deadly and thrilling, it was a message that set Alan into action. Rossland had been killed under a flag of truce, and even the men under Graham had something like respect for that symbol. He could expect no mercy, nothing now but the most terrible of vengeance at their hands, and as he dodged back from the window he cursed Sequenna under his breath, even as he felt the relief of knowing he was not dead. Before a shot had been fired from outside he was up the ladder. In another moment he was bending over the huddled form of the old Eskimo. "Come below," he commanded. "We must be ready to leave through the cellar pit." His hand touched Sequenna's face. It hesitated, groped in the darkness, and then grew still over the old warrior's heart. There was no tremor or beat of life in the aged beast. Sequenna was dead. The guns of Graham's men opened fire again. Volley after volley crashed into the cabin as Alan descended the ladder. He could hear bullets tearing through the chinks and windows as he turned quickly to the shelter of the pit. He was amazed to find that Mary Standish had returned and was waiting for him there. End of chapter 25. Recording by Roger Moline.
Chapter 26 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 26. In the astonishment with which Mary's unexpected presence confused him for a moment, Alan stood at the edge of the trap, staring down at her pale face, heedless of the terrific gunfire that was assailing the cabin. That she had not gone with Keok and Nawadlook, but had come back to him, filled him with instant dread, for the precious minutes he had fought for were lost, and the priceless time gained during the parley with Rossland counted for nothing. She saw his disappointment and his danger, and sprang up to seize his hand and pull him down beside her. "Of course you didn't expect me to go," she said in a voice that no longer trembled or betrayed excitement. "You didn't want me to be a coward. My place is with you." He could make no answer to that, with her beautiful eyes looking at him as they were, but he felt his heart grow warmer and something rise up chokingly in his throat. "Sokwenna is dead, and Rossland lies out there, shot under a flag of truce," he said. "We can't have many minutes left to us." He was looking at the square of light where the tunnel from the cellar pit opened into the ravine. He had planned to escape through it alone and keep up a fight in the open, but with Mary at his side it would be a desperate gauntlet to run. "Where are Keok and Nawadlook?" he asked. "On the tundra, hurrying for the mountains. I told them it was your plan that I should return to you. When they doubted, I threatened to give myself up unless they did as I commanded them. And, Alan, the ravine is filled with the rain mist and dark." She was holding his free hand closely to her breast. "It is our one chance," he said. "And aren't you glad, a little glad, that I didn't run away without you?" Even then he saw the sweet and tremulous play of her lips as they smiled at him in the gloom, and heard the soft note in her voice that was almost playfully chiding, and the glory of her love as she had proved it to him there drew from him what he knew to be the truth. "Yes, I am glad. It is strange that I should be so happy in a moment like this. If they will give us a quarter of an hour." He led the way quickly to the square of light and was first to creep forth into the thick mist. It was scarcely rain, yet he could feel the wet particles of it, and through this saturated gloom whining bullets cut like knives over his head. The blazing cabin illuminated the open on each side of Sokwenna's place, but deepened the shadows in the ravine, and a few seconds later they stood hand in hand in the blanket of fog that hid the coulee. Suddenly the shots grew scattering above them, then ceased entirely. This was not what Alan had hoped for. Graham's men, enraged and made desperate by Rossland's death, would rush the cabin immediately. Scarcely had the thought leaped into his mind when he heard swiftly approaching shouts, the trampling of feet, and then the battering of some heavy object at the barricaded door of Sokwenna's cabin. In another minute or two their escape would be discovered, and a horde of men would pour down into the ravine. Mary tugged at his hand. "Let us hurry up," she pleaded. What happened then seemed madness to the girl, for Alan turned and with her hand held tightly in his started up the side of the ravine, apparently in the face of their enemies. Her heart throbbed with sudden fear when their course came almost within the circle of light made by the burning cabin. Like shadows they sped into the deeper shelter of the corral buildings, and not until they paused there did she understand the significance of the hazardous chance they had taken. Already Graham's men were pouring into the ravine. "They won't suspect we've doubled on them until it's too late," said Alan exultantly. "We'll make for the kloof. Stampede and the herdsmen should arrive within a few hours, and when that happens—" A stifled moan interrupted him. Half a dozen paces away a crumpled figure lay huddled against one of the corral gates. "He's hurt," whispered Mary after a moment of silence. "I hope so," replied Alan pitilessly. "It will be unfortunate for us if he lives to tell his comrades we have passed this way." Something in his voice made the girl shiver. It was as if the vanishing point of mercy had been reached, and savages were at their backs. She heard the wounded man moan again as they stole through the deeper shadows of the corrals toward the niggerhead bottom. And then she noticed that the mist was no longer in her face. The sky was clearing. She could see Alan more clearly, and when they came to the narrow trail over which they had fled once before that night, it reached out ahead of them like a thin, dark ribbon. Scarcely had they reached this point when a rifle shot sounded not far behind. It was followed by a second and a third, and after that came a shout. It was not a loud shout. There was something strained and ghastly about it, and yet it came distinctly to them. "The wounded man," said Alan in a voice of dismay. "He's calling the others. I should have killed him." He traveled at a half-trot, and the girl ran lightly at his side. All her courage and endurance had returned. She breathed easily and quickened her steps, so that she was setting the pace for Alan. They passed along the crest of the ridge under which lay the willows and the pool, and at the end of this they paused to rest and listen. Trained to the varied night whisperings of the tundras, Alan's ears caught faint sounds which his companion did not hear. The wounded man had succeeded in giving his message, and pursuers were scattering over the plain behind them. "Can you run a little farther?" he asked. "Where?" He pointed, and she darted ahead of him, her dark hair streaming in a cloud that began to catch a faint luster of increasing light. Alan ran a little behind her. He was afraid of the light. Only gloom had saved them this night, and if the darkness of mist and fog and cloud gave way to clear twilight and the sun glow of approaching day before they reached the kloof, he would have to fight in the open. With Stampede at his side, he would have welcomed such an opportunity of matching rifles with their enemies, for there were many vantage points in the open tundra from which they might have defied assault. But the nearness of the girl frightened him. She, after all, was the hunted thing. He was only an incident. From him could be exacted nothing more than the price of death. He would be made to pay that, as Oquena had paid. For her remained the unspeakable horror of Graham's lust and passion. But if they could reach the kloof and the hiding place in the face of the cliff, they could laugh at Graham's pack of beasts while they waited for the swift vengeance that would come with Stampede and the herdsmen. He watched the sky. It was clearing steadily. Even the mists in the hollows were beginning to melt away, and in place of their dissolution came faintly rose-tinted lights. It was the hour of dawn. The sun sent a golden glow over the disintegrating curtain of gloom that still lay between it and the tundras, and objects 100 paces away no longer held shadow or illusionment. The girl did not pause, but continued to run lightly and with surprising speed, heeding only the direction which he gave her. Her endurance amazed him, and he knew that without questioning him she had guessed the truth of what lay behind them. Then all at once she stopped, swayed like a reed, and would have fallen if his arms had not caught her. "Splendid!" he cried. She lay gasping for breath, her face against his breast. Her heart was a swiftly beating little dynamo. They had gained the edge of a shallow ravine that reached within 1/2 mile of the kloof. It was this shelter he had hoped for, and Mary's splendid courage had won it for them. He picked her up in his arms and carried her again, as he had carried her through the niggerhead bottom. Every minute, every foot of progress counted now. Range of vision was widening. Pools of sunlight were flecking the plains. In another quarter of an hour moving objects would be distinctly visible a mile away. with his precious burden in his arms, her lips so near that he could feel their breath, her heart throbbing, he became suddenly unconscious of the incongruity of the bird song that was wakening all about them. It seemed inconceivable that this day, glorious in its freshness, and welcomed by the glad voice of all living things, should be a day of tragedy, of horror, and of impending doom for him. He wanted to shout out his protest and say that it was all a lie, and it seemed absurd that he should handicap himself with the weight and inconvenient bulk of his rifle when his arms wanted to hold only that softer treasure which they bore. In a little while Mary was traveling at his side again, and from then on he climbed at intervals to the higher swellings of the gully edge and scanned the tundra. Twice he saw men, and from their movements he concluded their enemies believed they were hidden somewhere on the tundra not far from the range houses. 3/4 of an hour later they came to the end of the shallow ravine, and 1/2 mile of level plain lay between them and the kloof. For a space they rested, and in this interval Mary smoothed her long hair and plaited it in 2 braids. In these moments Alan encouraged her, but he did not lie. He told her the 1/2 mile of tundra was their greatest hazard, and described the risks they would run. Carefully he explained what she was to do under certain circumstances. There was scarcely a chance they could cross it unobserved, but they might be so far ahead of the searchers that they could beat them out to the kloof. If enemies appeared between them and the kloof, it would be necessary to find a dip or shelter of rock and fight, and if pursuers from behind succeeded in outstripping them in the race, she was to continue in the direction of the kloof as fast as she could go, while he followed more slowly, holding Graham's men back with his rifle until she reached the edge of the gorge. After that he would come to her as swiftly as he could run. They started. Within 5 minutes they were on the floor of the tundra. About them in all directions stretched the sunlit plains. 1/2 mile back toward the range were moving figures. Farther west were others, and eastward, almost at the edge of the ravine, were 2 men who would have discovered them in another moment if they had not descended into the hollow. Alan could see them kneeling to drink at the little coulée which ran through it. "Don't hurry," he said with a sudden swift thought. "Keep parallel with me and a distance away. They may not discover you are a woman, and possibly may think we are searchers like themselves. Stop when I stop. Follow my movements." "Yes, sir." Now in the sunlight she was not afraid. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright as stars as she nodded at him. Her face and hands were soiled with muck stain, her dress spotted and torn, and looking at her thus, Alan laughed and cried out softly, "You beautiful little vagabond." She sent the laugh back, a soft, sweet laugh to give him courage, and after that she watched him closely, falling in with his scheme so cleverly that her action was better than his own, and so they had made their way over 1/3 of the plain when Alan came toward her suddenly and cried, "Now run!" A glance showed her what was happening. The 2 men had come out of the ravine and were running toward them. Swift as a bird she was ahead of Alan, making for a pinnacle of rock which he had pointed out to her at the edge of the kloof. Close behind her he said, "Don't hesitate a second. Keep on going. When they are a little nearer I'm going to kill them. But you mustn't stop." At intervals he looked behind him. The 2 men were gaining rapidly. He measured the time when less than 200 yards would separate them. Then he drew close to Mary's side. "See that level place ahead? We'll cross it in another minute or 2. When they come to it I'm going to stop and catch them where they can't find shelter. But you must keep on going.
I'll overtake you by the time you reach the edge of the kloof." She made no answer, but ran faster, and when they had passed the level space she heard his footsteps growing fainter, and her heart was ready to choke her when she knew the time had come for him to turn upon their enemies. But in her mind burned the low words of his command, his warning, and she did not look back, but kept her eyes on the pinnacle of rock, which was now very near. She had almost reached it when the first shot came from behind her. Without making a sound that would alarm her, Alan had stumbled and made pretense of falling. He lay upon his face for a moment as if stunned, and then rose to his knees. An instant too late, Graham's men saw his ruse when his leveled rifle gleamed in the sunshine. The speed of their pursuit was their undoing. Trying to catch themselves so that they might use their rifles, or fling themselves upon the ground, they brought themselves into a brief but deadly interval of inaction. And in that flash one of the men went down under Alan's first shot. Before he could fire again, the second had flattened himself upon the earth, and swift as a fox, Alan was on his feet and racing for the kloof. Mary stood with her back against the huge rock, gasping for breath, when he joined her. A bullet sang over their heads with its angry menace. He did not return the fire, but drew the girl quickly behind the rock. "He won't dare to stand up until the others join him," he encouraged her. "We're beating them to it, little girl. If you can keep up a few minutes longer." She smiled at him, even as she struggled to regain her breath. It seemed to her there was no way of descending into the chaos of rock between the gloomy walls of the kloof, and she gave a little cry when Alan caught her by her hands and lowered her over the face of a ledge to a table-like escarpment below. He laughed at her fear when he dropped down beside her and held her close as they crept back under the shelving face of the cliff to a hidden path that led downward, with a yawning chasm at their side. The trail widened as they descended, and at the last they reached the bottom, with the gloom and shelter of a million-year-old crevasse hovering over them. Grim and monstrous rocks, black and slippery with age, lay about them, and among these they picked their way, while the trickle and drip of water and the flesh-like clamminess of the air sent a strange shiver of awe through Mary Standish. There was no life here, only an age-old whisper that seemed a part of death, and when voices came from above, where Graham's men were gathering, they were ghostly and far away. But here, too, was refuge and safety. Mary could feel it as they picked their way through the chill and gloom that lay in the silent passages between the gargantuan rocks. When her hands touched their naked sides, an uncontrollable impulse made her shrink closer to Alan, even though she sensed the protection of their presence. They were like colossi, carved by hands long dead, and now guarded by spirits whose voices guttered low and secretly in the mysterious drip and trickle of unseen water. This was the haunted place. In this chasm death and vengeance had glutted themselves long before she was born, and when a rock crashed behind them, accidentally sent down by one of the men above, a cry broke from her lips. She was frightened, and in a way she had never known before. It was not death she feared here, nor the horror from which she had escaped above, but something unknown and indescribable for which she would never be able to give a reason. She clung to Alan, and when at last the narrow fissure widened over their heads and light came down and softened their way, he saw that her face was deathly white. "We are almost there," he comforted, "and some day you will love this gloomy kloof as I love it, and we will travel it together all the way to the mountains." A few minutes later,
They came to an avalanche of broken sandstone that was heaped halfway up by the face of the precipitous wall, and up this climbed until they came to a level shelf of rock, and back of this was a great depression in the rock, 40 feet deep and half as wide, with a floor as level as a table and covered with soft white sand. Mary would never forget her first glimpse of this place. It was unreal, strange, as if a band of outlaw fairies had brought the white sand for a carpet, and had made this their hiding place, where wind and rain and snow could never blow. And up the face of the cavern, as if to make her thought more real, led a ragged fissure, which it seemed to her only fairies' feet could travel, and which ended at the level of the plain. So they were tundra fairies, coming down from flowers and sunlight through that fissure, and it was from the evil spirits in the kloof itself that they must have hidden themselves. Something in the humour and gentle thought of it all made her smile at Alan. But his face had turned suddenly grim, and she looked up the kloof where they had travelled through danger and come to safety. And then she saw that which froze all thought of fairies out of her heart. Men were coming through the chaos and upheaval of rock. There were many of them, appearing out of the darker neck of the gorge into the clearer light, and at their head was a man upon whom Mary's eyes fixed themselves in horror. White-faced she looked at Alan. He had guessed the truth. "That man in the front?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Is John Graham?" He heard the words choking in her throat. "Yes, John Graham." He swung his rifle slowly, his eyes burning with a steely fire. "I think," he said, "that from here I can easily kill him." Her hand touched his arm. She was looking into his eyes. Fear had gone out of them, and in its place was a soft and gentle radiance, a prayer to him. "I am thinking of tomorrow, the next day, the years and years to come, with you," she whispered. "Alan, you can't kill John Graham. Not until God shows us it is the only thing left for us to do. You can't." The crash of a rifle between the rock walls interrupted her. The snarl of a bullet followed the shot. She heard it strike, and her heart stopped beating, and the rigidity of death came into her limbs and body as she saw the swift and terrible change in the stricken face of the man she loved. He tried to smile at her, even as a red blot came where the streak of gray in his hair touched his forehead, and then he crumpled down at her feet, and his rifle rattled against the rocks. She knew it was death. Something seemed to burst in her head and fill her brain with the roar of a flood. She screamed. Even the men below hesitated, and their hearts jumped with a new sensation as the terrible cry of a woman rang between the rock walls of the chasm. And following the cry, a voice came down to them. "John Graham, I'm going to kill you. Kill you!" And snatching up the fallen rifle, Mary Standish set herself to the task of vengeance. End of chapter 26 of The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander. Chapter 27 of The Alaskan. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Lars Rolander. The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 27. She waited. The ferocity of a mother defending her young filled her soul, and she moaned in her grief and despair as the seconds passed. But she did not fire blindly, for she knew she must kill John Graham. The troublesome thing was a strange film that persisted in gathering before her eyes, something she tried to brush away, but which obstinately refused to go. She did not know she was sobbing as she looked over the rifle barrel. The figures came swiftly, but she had lost sight of John Graham. They reached the upheaval of shattered rock and began climbing it, and in her desire to make out the man she hated, she stood above the rampart that had sheltered her. The men looked alike, jumping and dodging like so many big tundra hares as they came nearer, and suddenly it occurred to her that all of them were John Graham's, and that she must kill swiftly and accurately. Only the hiding fairies might have guessed how her reason trembled and almost fell in those moments when she began firing. Certainly John Graham and his men did not, for her first shot was a lucky one, and a man slipped down among the rocks at the crack of it. After that she continued to fire until the responseless click of the hammer told her the gun was empty. The explosions and the shock against her slight shoulder cleared her vision and her brain. She saw the men still coming, and they were so near she could see their faces clearly, and again her soul cried out in its desire to kill John Graham. She turned, and for an instant fell upon her knees beside Alan. His face was hidden in his arms. Swiftly she tore his automatic from its holster and sprang back to a rock. There was no time to wait or choose now, for his murderers were almost upon her. With all her strength she tried to fire accurately, but Alan's big gun leaped and twisted in her hand as she poured its fire wildly down among the rocks until it was empty. Her own smaller weapon she had lost somewhere in the race to the kloof, and now when she found she had fired her last shot, she waited through another instant of horror until she was striking at faces that came within the reach of her arm. And then, like a monster created suddenly by an evil spirit, Graham was at her side. She had a moment's vision of his cruel, exultant face, his eyes blazing with a passion that was almost madness, his powerful body lunging upon her. Then his arms came about her. She could feel herself crushing inside them, and fought against their cruel pressure, then broke limply and hung a resistless weight against him. She wasn't unconscious, but her strength was gone, and if the arms had closed a little more they would have killed her. And she could hear clearly. She heard suddenly the shots that came from up the kloof, scattered shots, then many of them, and after that the strange wild cries that only the Eskimo herdsmen make. Graham's arms relaxed. His eyes swept the fairy's hiding place with its white sand floor, and a fierce joy lit up his face. "Martens, it couldn't happen in a better place," he said to a man who stood near him. "Leave me 5 men. Take the others and help Schneider. If you don't clean them out, retreat this way, and 6 rifles from this ambuscade will do their business in a hurry." Mary heard the names of the men called who were to stay. The others hurried away. The firing in the kloof was steady now, but there were no cries, no shouts, nothing but the ominous crack of the rifles. Graham's arms closed about her again. Then he picked her up and carried her back into the cavern, and in a place where the rock walls sagged inward, making a pocket of gloom which was shut out from the light of day, he laid her upon the carpet of sand. Where the erosion of many centuries of dripping water had eaten its first step in the making of the ragged fissure, a fairy had begun to climb down from the edge of the tundra. He was a swift and agile fairy, very red in the face, breathing fast from hard running, but making not a sound as he came like a gopher, where it seemed no living thing could find a hold. And the fairy was Stampede Smith. From the lips of the kloof he had seen the last few seconds of the tragedy below, and where death would have claimed him in a more reasonable moment, he came down in safety now. In his finger ends was the old tingling of years ago, and in his blood the thrill which he had thought was long dead, the thrill of looking over leveled guns into the eyes of other men. Time had rolled back, and he was the old Stampede Smith. He saw under him lust and passion and murder, as in other days he had seen them. And between him and desire there was neither law nor conscience to bar the way, and his dream, a last great fight, was here to fill the final unwritten page of a life's drama that was almost closed. And what a fight! If he could make that carpet of soft white sand unheard and unseen. 6 to 1. 6 men with guns at their sides and rifles in their hands. What a glorious end it would be for a woman and Alan Holt. He blessed the firing up the kloof which kept the men's faces turned that way. He thanked God for the sound of combat, which made the scraping of rock and the rattle of stones under his feet unheard. He was almost down when a larger rock broke loose and fell to the ledge. 2 of the men turned, but in that same instant came a more thrilling interruption. A cry, a shrill scream, a woman's voice filled with madness and despair came from the depth of the cavern, and the 5 men stared in the direction of its agony. Close upon the cries came Mary Standish with Graham behind her, reaching out his hands for her. The girl's hair was flying, her face the color of white sand, and Graham's eyes were the eyes of a demon, forgetful of all else but her. He caught her. The slim body crumpled in his arms again, while pitifully weak hands beat futilely in his face. And then came a cry such as no man had ever heard in Ghost Kloof before. It was Stampede Smith. A sheer 20 feet he had leaped to the carpet of sand, and as he jumped his hands whipped out his 2 guns, and scarcely had his feet touched the floor to the soft pocket in the ledge when death crashed from them, swift as lightning flashes, and 3 of the 5 were tottering or falling before the 2 others could draw or swing a rifle. Only one of them had fired a shot. The other went down as if legs had been knocked from under him by a club, and the one who fired bent forward then, as if making a bow to death, and pitched on his face. And then Stampede Smith whirled upon John Graham. During these few swift seconds Graham had stood stunned, with the girl crushed against his breast. He was behind her, sheltered by her body, her head protecting his heart, and as Stampede turned he was drawing a gun, his dark face blazing with the fiendish knowledge that the other could not shoot without killing the girl. The horror of the situation gripped Stampede. He saw Graham's pistol rise slowly and deliberately. He watched it, fascinated, and the look in Graham's face was the cold and unexcited triumph of a devil. Stampede saw only that face. It was 4 inches, perhaps 5, away from the girl's. There was only that, and the extending arm, the crooking finger, the black mouth of the automatic seeking his heart. And then, in that last second, straight into the girl's staring eyes blazed Stampede's gun, and the 4 inches of leering face behind her was suddenly blotted out. It was Stampede and not the girl who closed his eyes then, and when he opened them and saw Mary Standish sobbing over Alan's body, and Graham lying face down in the sand, he reverently raised the gun from which he had fired the last shot, and pressed its hot barrel to his thin lips. Then he went to Alan. He raised the limp head, while Mary bowed her face in her hands. In her anguish she prayed that she, too, might die, for in this hour of triumph over Graham there was no hope of joy for her. Alan was gone. Only death could have come with that terrible red blot on his forehead, just under the grey streak in his hair. And without him there was no longer a reason for her to live. She reached out her arms. "Give him to me," she whispered. "Give him to me." Through the agony that burned in her eyes, she did not see the look in Stampede's face, but she heard his voice. "It wasn't a bullet that hit him," Stampede was saying. "The bullet hit a rock, and it was a chip from the rock that caught him square between the eyes. He isn't dead, and he ain't going to die." How many weeks or months or years it was after his last memory of the fairies' hiding place before he came back to life, Alan could make no manner of guess. But he did know that for a long, long time he was riding through space on a soft white cloud, vainly trying to overtake a girl with streaming hair who fled on another cloud ahead of him. And at last this cloud broke up like a great cake of ice, and the girl plunged into the immeasurable depth over which they were sailing, and he leaped after her. Then came strange lights and darkness and sounds like the clashing of cymbals and voices, and after those things a long sleep, from which he opened his eyes to find himself in a bed, and a face very near, with shining eyes that looked at him through a sea of tears. And a voice whispered to him sweetly, softly, joyously, "Alan." He tried to reach up his arms. The face came near. It was pressed against his own. Soft arms crept about him. Softer lips kissed his mouth and eyes, and sobbing whispers came with their love. And he knew the end of the race had come, and he had won. This was the 5th day after the fight in the kloof, and on the 6th he sat up in his bed, bolstered with pillows, and Stampede came to see him, and then Keok and Nawadlook and Tatpan and Topkok and Vegarok, his old housekeeper, and only for a few minutes at a time was Mary away from him. But Tautuk and Amok Tulik did not come, and he saw the strange change in Keok and knew that they were dead. Yet he dreaded to ask the question, for more than any others of his people did he love these two missing comrades of the tundras. It was Stampede who first told him in detail what had happened, but he would say little of the fight on the edge, and it was Mary who told him of that. "Graham had over 30 men with him, and only 10 got away," he said. "We have buried 16 and are caring for 7 wounded at the corrals. Now that Graham is dead, they're frightened stiff, afraid we're going to hand them over to the law. And without Graham or Rossland to fight for them, they know they're lost." "And our men, my people?" asked Alan faintly. "Fought like devils. Yes, I know, but they didn't rest an hour in coming from the mountains. You know what I mean, Stampede." "Not many, Alan. 7 were killed, including Sokwenna," and he counted over the names of the slain. Tautuk and Amok Tulik were not among them. "And Tautuk?" "He is wounded. Missed death by an inch, and it has almost killed Keok. She is with him night and day, and as jealous as a little cat if anyone else attempts to do anything for him." "Then I'm glad Tautuk was hit," smiled Alan. And he asked, "Where is Amok Tulik?" Stampede hung his head and blushed like a boy. "You'll have to ask her, Alan." And a little later Alan put the question to Mary. She too blushed, and in her eyes was a mysterious radiance that puzzled him. "You must wait," she said. Beyond that she would say no word, though he pulled her head down and with his hands in her soft smooth hair threatened to hold her until she told him the secret. Her answer was a satisfied little sigh, and she nestled her pink face against his neck and whispered that she was content to accept the punishment. So where Amuk Toolik had gone and what he was doing still remained a mystery. A little later he knew he had guessed the truth. "I don't need a doctor," he said, "but it was mighty thoughtful of you to send Amuk Toolik for one." Then he caught himself suddenly. "What a senseless fool I am! Of course there are others who need a doctor more than I do." Mary nodded. "But I was thinking chiefly of you when I sent Amuk Toolik to Tanana. He is riding Kauk and should return almost any time now." And she turned her face away so that he could see only the pink tip of her ear. "Very soon I will be on my feet and ready for travel," he said. "Then we will start for the States as we planned." "You will have to go alone, Alan, for I shall be too busy fitting up the new house," she replied in such a quiet, composed little voice that he was stunned. "I've already given orders for the cutting of timber in the foothills, and Stampede and Amuk Toolik will begin construction very soon. I'm sorry you find your business in the States so important, Alan. It will be a little lonesome with you away." He gasped. "Mary!" She did not turn. "Mary!" He could see again that little heart-like throb in her throat when she faced him. And then he learned the secret, softly whispered with sweet, warm lips pressed to his. "It wasn't a doctor I sent for, Alan. It was a minister. We need one to marry Stampede and Nawadlook and Tautuk and Keok. Of course, you and I can wait." But she never finished, for her lips were smothered with a love that brought a little sob of joy from her heart. And then she whispered things to him which he had never guessed of Mary Standish, and never quite hoped to hear. She was a little wild, a little reckless, it may be, but what she said filled him with a happiness which he believed had never come to any other man in the world. It was not her desire to return to the States at all. She never wanted to return. She wanted nothing down there, nothing that the Standish fortune builders had left her, unless he could find some way of using it for the good of Alaska. And even then she was afraid it might lead to the breaking of her dream. For there was only one thing that would make her happy, and that was his world. She wanted it just as it was, the big tundras, his people, the herds, the mountains, with the glory and greatness of God all about them in the open spaces. She now understood what he had meant when he said he was an Alaskan and not an American. She was that too, an Alaskan first of all. And for Alaska she would go on fighting with him, hand in hand, until the very end. His heart throbbed until it seemed it would break, and all the time she was whispering her hopes and secrets to him he stroked her silken hair until it lay spread over his breast and against his lips, and for the first time in years a hot flood of tears filled his eyes. So happiness came to them, and only strange voices outside raised Mary's head from where it lay, and took her quickly to the window where she stood, a vision of sweet loveliness, radiant in the tumbled confusion and glory of her hair. Then she turned with a little cry, and her eyes were shining like stars as she looked at Alan. "It is Amuk Toolik," she said. "He has returned." "And is he alone?" Alan asked, and his heart stood still while he waited for her answer. Demurely she came to his side and smoothed his pillow and stroked back his hair. "I must go and do up my hair, Alan," she said then. "It would never do for them to find me like this." And suddenly, in a moment, their fingers entwined and tightened, for on the roof of Sokwenna's cabin the little gray-cheeked thrush was singing again. End of chapter 27, and end of the book The Alaskan by James Oliver Curwood. Read by Lars Rolander.